Okay.
That looks good.
Should I get up there and do my juggling routine?
You shall. Okay, let's put this up here.
I need to get the bear on the motorcycle jungling the flaming chainsaws yet.
That's it.
All right. Larry, we need you. I wonder if there's like a wet rag or disinfectant rag so I can just get you a good clean.
We
lifestyle.
do. We have, I brought some disinfectant rags. It's a blue container.
See it?
Yeah, go for it. Hopefully I can go to the bathroom real quick. But probably not.
There's like two
Yeah.
boxes.
So just a three shift. I keep falling over that chair, and it may not be a good place to sit. I'm so frustrated.
Hopefully they didn't get lost, they gave them directions or.
Did it go back to work? Did it?
Bless you.
Thank you.
2 minutes until showtime.
Go
Okay.
ahead. Go ahead and go.
I got 1 minute to go to the bathroom. Sweet. I'm not used to that.
Just think back to high school.
Are you using those like? We'll find my rag. Right.
Nice shot. I just called them.
Hey, are you all lost? Yes. 1 minute until showtime.
Oh. That's always fun.
I'm wasting them there.
We have to import coffee in the big coffee pot here, and decaf coffee, and bagels, and muffins, and yogurt. Okay, good. All right, everybody. Stop and get.
I can't start
You
fixing
want
on
to take one of the
purpose.
big boxes of coffee? Is that coffee tasted?
Oh, it's good. Yeah. You got less than a minute, Paul. By the way, what's the, password for the internet here?
It was written down.
Your show will go live in 5 seconds.
5 seconds, hey,
Whoa, look at that.
all kinds of time.
Go ahead and record.
Not yet.
I'm gonna have some music, right?
You want a bottle of water to keep up there with you in case you get thirsty? Or
I've got my coffee.
Oh, okay.
Welcome everyone to Blog Talk Radio, / False Reformation. Welcome to welcome to the 2015 TANC conference, annually since 2012. That's the TANC Conference on Gospel Discernment and Spiritual Tyranny. So welcome as we kick off the conference with this first session. The introduction was last night. We'll be online sometime today. And welcome all of those who are viewing through Google Hangouts. And we have a QA on Google Hangouts, or you can ask questions to the speakers or comment by emailing us during the conference at mail@ttanc.com. That's mail@TonyTerryAliceNancyCat.com. And if somebody could bring me my iPad in that small case there, I will, I always forget to bring that up. I will keep an eye on our email. That's it. Thank you. I'll keep an eye on our email so that if you want to comment or ask a question, I've got the email right here. Okay. Now, I just want to welcome our guests also from various parts of the country that are staying at the Potter's House, and we have a lot of materials out and about at the Potter's House that are free reign. Pick up anything you like. But also at the Potter's House, we have some copies of some books that I would like to recommend. And first of all, we only have one copy of this. I didn't have time to call Bo Grissom or William Grissom, Dr. William Grissom, to get several copies of his book that he just published, Hath God Said, okay? And I want to recommend this book. I haven't had time to read it yet. Well, I skimmed through it, but Bo is an engineer, okay, has a PhD in engineering, and lots of good data on the Old Testament and charts and stuff that help you organize your thoughts. And here's one. I'm sure you can't see it, but you know, being an engineer, he likes to organize things that you can things in a way that you can hang your thoughts on them. Now, okay, the reason I want to recommend this book, and you can Google it, I'm sure, that's Grissom, Grissom, William Grissom, PhD, Hath God Said, Remember the Sabbath Day, ? You can Google that, and I'm sure find a way to purchase it. And then you can contact, it's got a email address here, wgrissom@att.net. And the reason I want to recommend this book is because it's written by a layman. And anything that is written by lay people, we have to encourage. Okay? So would I agree with everything in here or none of it? I don't know. But Christians have to take the Assembly of Christ back from Protestant academia. All right, 500 years of Protestant academia has gotten us where we're at today, and not very far. By their own admission, we are what? Train wrecks. They say it all the time. Susan and I went to a concert, and one of the most well-known evangelical contemporary music artists in our day stood up and said of Christians, we're nothing but a bunch of train wrecks. Okay? So by their own admission, that's where Protestant academia has brought us 500 years later. And then we talked last night about what the Apostle Paul said to Christians and what James said to the Christians that were being exploited in the churches by the nobles of that day. Look among you. You know, what's the state of your calling? Not many noble, not many, I don't know, rich, educated, whatever. Jesus Christ, when he came, what he started was a laity movement. The Assemblies of Christ is a laity movement. Okay? It's not a movement that does well or lives barely at all by Gnostic elitism. Okay? Now, another book that I want to recommend is, and again, at the Potter's House, we have several copies of this. Okay? Not several, but first come, serve, first serve. They're in the foyer there. Unfortunately, you're going to have to get that on the internet. We have 1 copy. But I did buy up several copies of Houses That Changed the World by Wolfgang Simpson. All right? Now, I reject his sanctification theology out of hand. But as far as his thoughts on home fellowships versus the institutional church, profound. You know, it's one, I could have had a V8 moment after another. Okay? Then in chapter 2, he goes into an amazing history about the early Assemblies of Christ. Okay? So then you get into the latter part of the books, and he gets into the theology, and not so great. But the first half of the book is a must-read. All right? Then another book that we have a couple copies of, again, you're free to take this, is In the Arena of the Mind by John Vandegrift. Reformed guy, okay? But the book was inspired by first generation so-called biblical counseling that Jay Adams started. And the reason I recommend this book is it's got this very practical, grammatical, biblical application to your thinking. Okay? A lot of times Christians focus a lot on our behavior. All right? But this book has a lot to say about our thinking, okay, in scriptures that talk about behavior in our mind or obedience in our mind. Remember, Jesus told the Pharisees, you're anti-law in your thinking, he said heart, but in the Bible, for the most part, the word heart is an idiom for the mind, okay? Jesus said, for instance, why do you think an evil thought in your heart? All right, well, where do we think thoughts in our mind? So it's an idiom for the mind, all right? And by the way, another booklet you can pick up for free that's in the hallway there is a layman work by a guy named Brian Johnson that is on heart and flesh. And basically what the guy did is went through and documented all of the places that it talks about wicked heart versus redeemed heart, so on and so forth. What he illustrates in his really in-depth word study is in no place in the Bible anywhere does it say that the heart of the Christian is wicked. That is only stated in regard to that's only stated in regard to the wicked. Okay? So, is something not online? Anyway, another book that I recommend. Okay? Okay. Okay. All right. So, we're a little late on the video, but that's okay. That's why we got the recorders going, right?
Yes.
So basically, that's why we do it this way. I'll take that audio and put it with the Google video and then piece that in, okay? So we do what we do for a reason, okay? And after all, we're all totally depraved sinners, and mistakes are to be expected. All right. Turn with me. Let's start today and get this going. Is this clock correct?
Yes.
Okay. We have a 10:15, and I have till when to get this talk done?
10:30.
No. 10:30?
You have an hour 47.
You got an hour.
An hour.
And there's
Okay.
15 minutes between sessions, right? The next session.
Yeah,
is
so
10:45.
this talk is, does somebody have the schedule in front of them? This talk is to end at
10:30.
10:30. Okay. Well, I better get to it then. And basically, if anyone wants a transcript, they're in that case there. Okay. And let me see here. We'll get going on this. And I just want to start out with a little introduction here because, incredibly, as of yet anyway, I don't have any slideshows like the other speakers do, but I do have the chalkboard. All right? And I want to denote a difference, okay? There's really only two religions in the world. And here they are. And Jesus said, I'm not going to go to the passage, but Jesus said, in the latter days, speaking of the latter days, because of wickedness, the hearts of many will grow cold, or there will be a lack of love. Okay?
Matthew 24:12.
Matthew 24:12. The psalmist said, Lord, their heart is like fat, but I love your law. All right, so we have this difference, this dichotomy that really frames the whole Bible. That is, let me put it this way. When Christ said, because of wickedness, that word is really antinomianism. So we have this dichotomy between antinomianism and love. Okay, is what we have. There's only two religions. There's antinomianism and there's love. And that's it. Well, what is love? If you love me, keep my commandments. Okay? So let me frame it another way. There's, by and large, religions have always been predicated on salvation being this way. There's a starting point, A, where you're saved. And it progresses to B, and salvation is a process. And you're in the middle. Okay? You're in the middle living in this process. 99.999% of all religions in the world, whatever label you want to put on it, has the idea that you can listen to in the sermons of salvation being a progression. Okay? I used to say it myself as a good Protestant. Sanctification is the growing part of salvation. Salvation does not grow. Okay? It's not a tree. All right? Like John Piper says it is. Salvation is not a tree with roots and the fruits that come from the roots. No. Salvation is a one-time event that we call the new birth, to where you are transformed from what you were to a totally new creature. Okay? So it's like this, and I've framed it before as a linear gospel versus a parallel gospel. So you're saved, okay? And you're saved, and you got your life here, okay? And this is glorification, okay? But when you're saved here, this is guaranteed, okay? When you're saved here, this is guaranteed. All right, and another dichotomy, and a way you can frame it is that, and I'm going to talk about this in my talk, things are switched. All right? One of the things that's switched is fear. When you become saved, before you're saved, you fear condemnation. You fear the final judgment. Okay? When you're saved, you no longer fear condemnation. You won't be at the final judgment. Glorification is guaranteed. And your salvation, so this line doesn't indicate a progression of salvation. It indicates a guarantee, like Monopoly. Go directly to wherever, do not pass go, all that stuff. It's guaranteed. Glorification is guaranteed. And then sanctification runs parallel to your new self, your salvation, and then glory. Okay? In all of the other religions that is progressive, because that you live your life in the middle of salvation progression, your Christian life is really, really tricky, because there's no way avoiding the fact that you're participating in the salvation process because it's ongoing. So sanctification is like a minefield. You've got to have this formula for living your life in a certain way that where the progression of salvation is not upset. Okay? So that's why we've got all of these religions and formulas for getting from point A to point B. But one thing that you need to get you there is the institutional church, because that's why God started that corporation on earth, to help people to get from point A to point B. That's what the institutional church is about. Okay? That's what it's all about, helping people get from point A. And invariably, even though congregants misunderstand what's taught in most of these religions, you don't find out whether you're in or out till you get to the final judgment. And by the way, that's Protestantism. That's Protestantism. If you know what you're talking about in Protestantism. You don't know for certain that you're in until you stand in the final judgment and are judged according to whether or not you lived by faith alone in your Christian life well enough. Okay? So I just wanted to get that in there. Okay? And if that clock's right, I've got 40 whole minutes. Right? All right, we're looking good. So I'll get into my talk here. All right? So, who do we think we are? Why would Western culture be immune from populist deception? In fact, history, even recent history, reveals the danger of collective logic, whether by tradition or some sort of neo-movement. Moreover, examples of bad fruit coming from collective logic can be taken from the best of what Western culture has to offer. There is one constant that shapes culture. Change occurs as a result of bad fruit. The collective pain threshold begins to surpass the threshold of life value. Okay? Society then becomes split into two types of people, those with new ideas and those willing to listen. We're seeing that in our day with the front runners in the Republican Party being outside of the political culture, okay? And people are totally perplexed about what's going on. This is what's going on. The threshold of pain has gone beyond, and now people are looking for something else. Tyranny has always been a foolish endeavor by virtue of God's designs of things. The reason is simple. The people always outnumber the rulers, and the rulers need people to have a government. And you can only kill so many people, all right? This is why controlling the way people think is so important. This taps into human resource without killing the donor. From the cradle of society, caste was the norm. Unfortunately, the consensus had always been that bad fruit had nothing to do with the system, but only those running it. The American experiment was the first successful challenge to collectivism. The definition of the words and the understanding of them are a matter of life and death on a massive scale. For example, quote, individualism does not exclude cooperation in the organization for common good, but rather ask who will determine what the common good is and how one reaches that conclusion. The assumption that individualism leads to societal chaos has in fact produced chaos in incomprehensible proportions. Once again, history is repeating itself in many ways, but the particular aspect that TANC focuses on is Protestantism. Once again, fruit demands reevaluation because of the threshold of pain. But this time, the historical reevaluation is utterly unique because it is post-American Revolution. For the first time in over 50 years, Protestantism faces a reevaluation without the force of state at its disposal. Nevertheless, Protestantism has done its job well. It yet has no fear of replacement because those who have given up on it believe there is no alternative. Hence, all right, its utter failure has produced no competitors. The nuns and the duns are just that, none and done. Yet, lest Protestantism would break from protocol and show mercy to its detractors, the nuns and the duns are declared damned to hell on their way out to the wilderness of hopelessness because being a member in good standing in the institutional church is synonymous with loving Christ and being a legitimate part of his body. We at TANC reject such an arrogant notion with extreme prejudice and believe we understand a legitimate alternative, a return to the assembly of Christ and its priesthood of believers, a return to individual gifts, not spiritual collectivism, fellowship, not membership, leadership, not dictatorship, organization, not institutionalization, not many masters, but only one, a body, not a corporation, and finally, freedom of conscience. Individual saints with one word, one Lord, and one body. It's a body, not a spiritual caste system. And we have but one mediator, the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay? And that goes right over our heads. I mean, in our day, to where the contemporary churches come in the form of neo-Calvinism, they say straight up that they're God's authority on earth. If anyone has seen the James McDonald video that I've got on the widget of Paul's Passing Thought, he says straight up, when the elders of his church speak together on something, they are speaking for Christ. Okay? So we read along in our Bible, and over again, we hear there's one mediator between man and God. There's one mediator between man and God. And we're like, that goes right over our head. But see, the reason that's pounded home over and over and over again in the New Testament is because they were facing the exact same thing that we're facing today. This whole idea that there's these God-appointed, always preordained, by the way, mediators between man and God. As Al Mohler said at a conference, pastors are God's preordained ministers to save God's people from ignorance. Okay? Well, that's a problem. Because first of all, their take on justification is completely upside down, and their take on justification defines a Christian as what the Bible says is a lost person. Okay? Biblicism. The alternative to Protestant orthodoxy is biblicism. What is it? Let's begin with a definition from Wikipedia. This is by and far the best definition of biblicism that I have ever found, and unfortunately listed under an alternative name for biblicism, biblical literalism. Or as one pastor told me, you're a wooden literalist. Okay? And it's rightly noted by Wikipedia, often used as a pejorative. It really is. Don't you know, any biblicist that has read Matthew 5:30 is cut off his right hand or feels guilty that he hasn't. All right, so let's examine the definition. Alternatively, the term can refer to the historical grammatical method, a hermeneutic technique that strives to uncover the meaning of the text by taking into account not just the grammatical words, but also the syntactical aspects, the cultural and historical background, and the literary genre. Okay? It emphasizes the referential aspect of the words in the text without denying the relevance of literary aspects, genre, or figures of speech within the text. For example, parable, allegory, simile, and metaphor. Let me add that biblicism starts with literalism and the plain sense of the text first, and then utilizes the elements of the historical grammatical methods as needed to make the rendering consistent with the rest of Scripture. As one person said, when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. That's where the biblicist starts. Let me also add that the biblicist would normally be impressed with a method of interpretation known as Occam's razor. Okay? Again, we'll get a wiki for that, but let me just put something in here really quick. When we talk about the historical grammatical method of interpreting Scripture versus the historical redemptive method of interpreting Scripture, which I'm going to get into in more detail later on, okay? We need to back up to the very beginning of the Reformation, and know this, please. Know this, please. This isn't merely a conversation about how to interpret the Bible, the best way to interpret the Bible. No, 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 no. This is an argument about the very interpretation of reality itself. Okay? Luther and Calvin were in the business of interpreting state of being, not the Bible. Okay? And we're seeing that in our series on the Heidelberg Disputation. Okay? And I'm not going to get on a rabbit track on that, but the very first doctrinal statement of the Reformation has 40 theses, and 12 of them are purely philosophical, in an argument about who knew best, Plato or Aristotle. Okay? Now, Occam's razor is a problem-solving principle devised by William of Ockham. Okay? Am I pronouncing that correct?
Occam.
Occam? Thank you. All right. It states that among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be selected. All right. Other more complicated solutions may ultimately prove correct, but in the absence of certainty, the fewer assumptions that are made, the better. And in a conversation that we had with Andy last night, where he shared a certain sermon that he heard, there were a lot of assumptions in that sermon, okay? Like the assumption that thirst really doesn't mean thirst, okay? Well, I think we're going to go with thirst means thirst, and words mean things, okay? That's the best objective information here, and that's what we're going with, okay? In context of the layperson, learning is a jigsaw puzzle. I want to use this example of a jigsaw puzzle that is a map of Xenia, all right, that I'm working on at the house. Let's say the map, to the degree that it is fitted together, represents knowledge of Xenia. Until the puzzle is completely fitted together with all the pieces, what do we do with the pieces that we can't get to fit into the map presently? The answer is we lay those pieces aside for the time being. Dear layman, you don't need the scholars. In fact, please remember that we live in the information age. Study to show yourself approved as a workman, okay? You're not going to hell because the Apostle Paul called you a workman. Sanctification is about work, okay, without fear of condemnation, all right? As a parenthesis regarding interpretation, let me offer all of the proof you need to know that every verse of Scripture must be interpreted in context of justification or sanctification. Now, traditionally in Protestantism, every verse, if they're honest, here, let me make it really, really simple. In Protestantism, unless you're going to hell, okay, every verse is about justification, okay? And that's why we don't know how to help people with the Word of God, because for 500 years, every verse has been about justification. And if they're honest, it boils down to that, okay? But another method of sanctification or interpretation that the Biblicists use in almost every verse in the Bible, we ask, what is the context here? Salvation, i.e. justification, or sanctification, okay? Christians throughout the New Testament are referred to as workmen. If justification is not a finished work, the fact that we are participants is unavoidable, either by direct participation or intentional non-participation. And here's one of the clever things that Protestantism does, okay? Non-participation is supposedly a non-work work. So in Protestantism, you have work that would damn you to hell, because that's work salvation. And then you have faith alone works, okay? And it's anybody's guess how that's split up, so that you know how to live and you got your best shot of going to glory when you stand in the big, massive white throne judgment. And see, that's why we need John Piper and all these people, because they're the experts on how to live your Christian life by faith alone, okay? But non-participation, intentional non-participation is doing something. It's making a choice. If justification is not a finished work, invariably religious formulas for works and faith alone works emerge. The problem here is evident. If you can lose your salvation, what do you have to do to keep it? Okay? So supposedly, not doing anything in order to keep your salvation is not work salvation. I beg to differ. And that's why this construct is a problem. Okay? Because in order to get to heaven, you got to either intentionally not do anything or do something. Either way, you're in a big problem. Okay? What we are talking about here is deductive, inductive study of the Bible that begins with the presupposition that man is able to reason. Here is where we must stop and state a huge historical fact in this matter that is irrefutable. Okay? Historically, there have only been two schools of thought in Bible interpretation, the historical grammatical method and the historical redemptive method. But please, if you don't take anything else away from this, please know that the dirty little secret is this. And I already spoke to this. This is two different ways of interpreting reality itself, and the way we interpret the Bible is a result of that. But it starts there. Okay? It starts there. How reality is interpreted. If you have been following our TANC series on the Heidelberg Disputation, earlier I mentioned this. Luther believed that all of reality is a redemptive metaphysical narrative written by God. Okay? Look out the window right now. Okay? There's not any cars driving down that street. All right? But if you see a car driving down the street, the only reason that happened is because it's part of the metaphysical narrative that God has pre-written. So that's what they're talking about when they say that everything is interpreted through the cross. All right? Right next door, if you noticed, right next door, walking in, we have a counseling ministry called Crosswalk. Well, what's that? That's walking by the cross. Okay? We're going to counsel you. You've got lots of problems in your life. You're on Prozac, Xanax. Wow, you're on like 10 different medications. Life really has your panties in a bundle. Okay? But see, what we're going to teach you to do is not take life so seriously. God is in control. And that sounds good. When we hear these preachers say, God is in control. Well, yeah. God is in control equals relax. There's nothing you can do. God has predetermined everything. This is all just a pre-written narrative by God that is a redemptive story from beginning to end, and is all reality is this pre-written redemptive narrative about Christ. You're not in control of any of it. There's nothing you can do. So don't worry, be happy. God is in control. And here's the good news. If you're saved, you're going to heaven and God's glorified. But the reason He's glorified is because you're a specimen of the antithesis of what you deserved. So God's glorified. But even if you do go to hell, that's kind of a bummer. But rejoice in this. It glorifies God. Read carefully what these people teach. Okay? So, like, I have people email me, and they're like, yeah, I get it now. Because these people in our church lost their young child. And they were completely all right. I mean, you know, because I would be a basket case if I lost one of my children. That means I belong to the glory story. You know, I'm earthbound, okay? you know, I have no hope, all right? But it's like, you know, you go to these churches and these tragedies happen and people are actually rejoicing, okay? And people stand back and look at that and they go, wow, look at that faith, okay? No, what it is Platonism, okay? It's a disconnect from reality to where your attitude is that all reality is nothing but an illusion and you don't have to take it seriously. And if you were at the conference 2 years ago, I quoted a paragraph from a Reformed blog that said exactly that. When you have bad experiences in your life, you could step back and disconnect yourself from that bad experience because it doesn't define you. Okay? What is, you know, Andy's going to talk about in this conference of what a Christian is, what the definition of a Christian is. Okay? Well, their definition is that you're a pot, God is the potter, and God has made some pots for glory and some pots for damnation. Either way, he's glorified. All right? So, the only reason that just happened is because God wrote it into the script of the metaphysical narrative, what many of the Reformed call, this is what they call it, the divine drama. They use that terminology all the time. What do you think they're talking about? Okay? Hence, salvation is only an ability to perceive or see the story. Okay? They define the new birth as only an ability to perceive. If this guy's lost, he simply can't see the kingdom. He can't perceive the pre-written gospel narrative. But if you're saved, you can see the kingdom, i.e., you know that all of this is not real. It's a story written by God, pre-written story by God. Okay? The unregenerate are defined by those who think they have any measure of free will. To have free will is the ability to write your own reality. Okay? Luther's assessment of free will is therefore called the glory story of man. Either one confesses that God wrote the story of history and reality, or man is foolishly trying to write his own reality. So free will equals writing your own reality. Okay? Luther, you're making yourself God. Okay? Luther received this idea primarily from St. Augustine and St. Gregory, established the Protestant Reformation with its premise, and John Calvin later articulated its supposed life application in the Calvin Institutes of the Christian religion. It called for a repeat of our spiritual baptism throughout the Christian life by progressively seeing and perceiving two things: the depravity of man and the holiness of God. Plunging the depths of our sinfulness supposedly brings about humbleness and self-death, resulting in a resurrection of joy regarding our original salvation. Therefore, the joy of our salvation is progressively increased throughout our Christian lives, regardless of circumstances. In fact, tragedy only facilitates our ability to see our depravity and the judgment that we deserve. Tragedy is merely a part of God's pre-written gospel narrative. Consequently, spiritual baptism is not a one-time event, but is repeated throughout our Christian life. The Bible has one purpose and one purpose only: to aid the, quote, believer continually revisiting salvation and the perpetual revisiting of spiritual baptism. This is an official Protestant doctrine called mortification and vivification. It's a perpetual death and rebirth. Okay? Several Protestant organizations use this chart below to illustrate this doctrine and the historical redemptive use of the Bible. And since I didn't do slideshows, I'll draw it for you. It's the dreaded cross chart. By the way, there's a big debate right now going on in the neo-Calvinist movement about Calvinistic Pentecostals, Reformed Charismatics, and there's this big debate. I guess John Piper says, yeah, Charismatics can be Reformed. And then you got other people, blowfish, blowhards, saying, no they can't, no they can't. Charismatic and Pentecostal doctrine is completely, what do you want to say, opposed to Calvinistic doctrine or Reformed doctrine. No, it isn't. Do you know the speaking in tongues and the ecstatic experience? Okay, what did I just teach? Okay, here's their chart. Here's your life. Salvation is here. Okay, and then all of Christian life is like this. You focus on two things: the holiness of God and your sinfulness. A deeper and deeper realization of your sinfulness makes the cross bigger. Okay? Now, next door, if you go to them for counseling, they're going to lie to you and say their counseling is about change. What's changing here? You or the cross? The cross. Right. This is their chart, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide on it, but it's like all over the place. Okay? No. The gospel is glorified. The gospel is made bigger by you realizing more and more and more how sinful you are, is in contrast to God's holiness. That's the premise of the whole thing. Okay? So basically, they call their doctrine mortification and vivification. Okay? In plunging the death, or what Luther called being brought down to hell, or being brought down to despair, that's the mortification part. And what that results in is a rebirth of joy, okay, because the cross is bigger in your life, or your vision of the gospel and the appreciation of the holiness of God and your salvation gets bigger, and that this results in this joy experience, okay? And I've quoted these guys several on that. Let me ask you something, okay? This is mortification. This is vivification, okay? Let me ask you something. In the ecstatic experiences of Pentecostals and Charismatics, which is which? Right? And I heard a charismatic preacher teach on this. Well, it's the vivification part. It's the rebirth. It's the re-salvation experience. It's just another form of the original. Okay? It's this continual re-experience or perpetual re-experience of your original new birth. Okay? So, is charismaticism and Pentecostalism consistent with Calvinistic and Reformed soteriology? Well, of course it is. Okay? It just fleshes itself out differently. Okay? Really, both are based, as well as Catholicism, on the linear gospel. Salvation grows. Okay? Charismatic soteriology is full of these, Holy Spirit on the installment plan constructs. It's the same thing. Okay? Therefore, God uses circumstances in the Bible to help us in the downward trajectory illustrated by this chart. A contrary perspective on reality is illustrated by another chart widely published by Protestant organizations, okay? And here it is. I don't have it on, but I'll draw it for you, okay? If this goes up, what happens? Okay? The cross is smaller. You're making the gospel smaller because it's about your glory story and you writing your own reality. And the gospel isn't glorified. Okay? I had a Reformed guy sharing a Bible study with us. You know, he was utterly disgusted, by his mother-in-law, who was terminally ill with cancer. And she got into some pretty serious depression because, and the focus of it was the fact that she wasn't going to get to see her grandchildren grow up. And his attitude was literally, she's pathetic. You know, she loves her grandchildren more than the glorious Jesus Christ. It's pathetic. You know, by and large, that's the mentality that develops. Okay? Now, I went to a funeral of an old pastor friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years and was kind of part of the gang that I hung around with. And I predicted when I went to the funeral that there wouldn't be a wet eye in the place. And there wasn't. He was a fairly well-known pastor, and hundreds of people were there. You know, very stoic. You know, his very own son got up in front of everybody and proudly announced that his dad was a wicked sinner at his funeral. He goes, I just want to stand up here today and tell you that my father was a wicked sinner. It is what it is, eh? Okay? Is this the doctrine that people really want to raise their children in? Okay? Crazy. What's behind the popularity of this worldview? Simply an ability to live a carefree life without fear of unknown circumstances, with the only exception being your eternal destiny. We all know that investing in life can set us up for enhanced disappointments and suffering. This is a worldview that completely separates us from the responsibilities of life and suffering. Don't worry, be happy. Susan and I have an inkling of what makes this doctrine so popular. Last week, we lost our beloved coaster, okay? Our cat, all right? And what was really sad about it is we had no choice but to put him down. And that's what makes it tough, because he's alive, but yet, you know, the only thing really to do is to put him down. So on the way home, we were like, well, when Twitch dies, you know, and Twitch is black and Coaster was white, so we don't have the yin and yang thing going on anymore. So we said, well, after Twitch dies, we'll never have another pet. See, that's an inkling of that. You know, this hurts, so therefore we're not going to invest in life. We're not going to invest in love because it's risky. Okay? This is a cowardly doctrine. This is a cowardly doctrine that runs away from life and blames everything on God. And that's what we're teaching our children, okay? And it's okay, you know, And this is where the home fellowship movement is going to find its biggest challenge. People who aren't willing to be alone for a while and pay the price. Yeah.
Can I just interject something real quick?
Sure.
That does tremendous damage to the psyche of the individual as well.
Mm-hmm.
We as human beings were made with the capacity to grieve. And the grieving part is necessary. When both my parents died, my mother and my father, I bawled my eyes out. I was the only, of all my family, I was the only one bawling my eyes out, which really surprised me. My brothers didn't, my dad's sisters were sad, but they were, and I think it was just more than just trying to be tough and putting on a strong face. Mm-hmm. I think it goes back to like what you were saying about there not being a wet eye in the place because, hey, he's in a better place and this
right.
and that. But I think if you don't grieve, you cannot heal. And I think that grieving part is necessary for the healing to take place. And if you don't heal, if you don't grieve, you don't heal, and that leaves a tremendous amount of emotional damage to the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what you've got going on in all these Calvinist churches,
mm-hmm.
is people are not allowed to grieve.
Right.
And they're not allowed to be emotional. It was part of the Jewish culture. Goodness gracious.
Right.
When somebody died in Israel, there was a mourning period of 2 weeks
right.
or something like that?
Right.
And that's all they did was grieve. And it was so that they could heal and get done with that and get
right.
it all out, and the healing happened, and then they could continue on with life.
Right.
I think that's important.
And we can't forget, Jesus said in the latter days, the hearts of many will wax cold, okay, because of antinomianism. Read your Bible for yourself when a couple is pointed out that just lost their child, and they're saying, look at him. They're actually rejoicing, and, I get emails from people, they're pointed as these spiritual heroes because they lost their toddler son, and they're not only not mourning, they're rejoicing that he's in a better place, so on and so forth. And I was feeling like, gee, what's wrong with me? And I'm really a loser because I would be a basket case. No, this is a cold-hearted detachment from reality. This is what this doctrine propagates. Okay. Now, the rest of my study, okay, is 10 points that was going to be a quick read anyway, of 10 points against Biblicism. All right? And I'm just going to close with this. The whole idea of Biblicism drives the Reformed nuts. They hate it. But in regard to what we just talked about in the discussion that we just had, if the laity would just read the Bible for themselves, what do you see? You see real life happening. You see Dorcas, was that her name? Okay, who died. And people coming to Paul and weeping and showing that the clothes that she had made and the acts of love. What did Paul do? Okay? You guys are a bunch of losers. She's with the glorious Jesus. Okay? What's this with these material clothing and all these don't you know that these are filthy rags? Isaiah said it. All of the works of men are filthy rags. What are you doing? Bringing me all of these clothes she made for you and glorifying her instead of Jesus. Is that what the Apostle Paul did? No. What did he do?
He was effective. He was effective.
He resurrected her. He jerked her back from Jesus. How dare him? She was in a better place. Okay? Now, I'm not saying she wasn't. Of course she was. But would people just read their Bibles for themselves and stop listening to these Gnostic fools? Okay? So I'm going to close with that. We have, I think, John coming up next. Okay? And we're live. And thanks for joining us on Google Hangouts. This will conclude our radio show for today. Are there any callers that want to call in, okay, and talk to us? They can do that because our speakers are far enough away from our main mic. And that concludes my first session. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah.
You got the slides.
And then the recording can be turned off. Yeah, we're good. Okay. And then you're going to want to end the
Only
episode.
because I was playing around with myself earlier.
I'm glad. I have your cool TANC Ministries shroud for the.
Too much going on to hang it. Now you can check these boxes and then press send. Now, what we would have done had we thought, time left, 21 minutes, wouldn't have been worth it. So then, okay, we're still recording. So, yeah, there you go. Press stop over there. I know I do that too, press record again. So basically what I'm going to show you to do, because they got really super fast internet here, okay, basically what I'm going to show, what we're going to do is that,
Send this feed to the lady. Actually, no, that's a zip file. Double click.
Yeah.
We're going to wait and send the video later. People can feed on the Google.
Can I just unzip them right onto your thumb drive?
No, but what I'm going to show you to do is when John's talk is done, you'll set up, I'm going to show you how to set up a podcast on Blog Talk Radio, and you'll upload his talk on the recording to a podcast. Huh? Yeah, right. Everybody's the same. Now, he won't be on radio because we only get one live production a day, but unlimited podcasts. So after he's done talking, I'm going to show you how to set up the podcast with the recording of his talk. Okay, and then you'll record him per the usual. And then on Google Hangouts, we just remain live for the duration.
So when he starts, just start on recording and camera back up.
Right. He'll tell you when he's ready. So this you don't have to worry about till later. However, you can do this. We might as well upload the video of my first talk to YouTube for Robin, and I will show you how to do that.
While you were talking, one of the little modern catchphrases you added around is "let go and let God." That kind of it falls in line with that. God is just
Right.
Have you heard that one?
Yeah.
Let go and let
Yeah, is it
God.
possible to bring that closer to
I
me?
mean, it's,
I can, but this doesn't have horizontal keystone correction on it. So it's going to be, if I do that, it's going to be like that.
Yeah, I see. Okay, interesting. That's well, if you can bring it.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. This goes over here.
Oh,
Yeah, I moved it over that way so that I could, because I was using the chalkboard.
Oh, fantastic. That'd be even better.
And do you have copies of your books we can put in the foyer at the Potter's house? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Slide you over here.
Yeah, now. Yeah, look at that.
So, can people online see that?
They absolutely can.
Fantastic.
That's why we're doing it this way.
So that picks up.
They can see that.
Reading some of
Okay.
the books.
Yeah.
Because of the bookmark.
Yeah, they absolutely can.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was in the bathroom,
Yeah.
I was in the bathroom, grabbing the money.
Get your,
And here's one of my books, called, that's Dog Stickers.
No, Andy, that might have been this.
That, there.
It's bigger.
Well, no, your, the iPad doesn't, my phone's gonna fade out. Probably didn't take a disk space. Oh, well, I'll just go over it. I'm gonna move the book here.
Okay, now we can shift this over here and on the video. Yep.
Lunch.
Lunch, and then you. Yeah, you and John switch.
Oh, okay.
Because we've got lunch at noon.
Okay, we're gonna quit eating, I got more food to say.
That? It's here, but we want it the way it is so that we can not only see him, but what he's got up on the screen.
Right. I was just wondering for future reference if I need to zoom.
Hmm.
Okay, so
So what you want to do, before John starts, go ahead and properly eject that card out of there.
that's okay.
Okay. Menu. Edit. Copy. All scenes. What's it saying?
Not enough space available.
Okay. So just go ahead and put this back in and delete whatever's on there.
Yeah.
But you know what? Oh, no, go ahead. Stream. No, double click on it. Back up, go back. Just go to stream. Okay, well, here's the deal, okay?
So am I live? So if I'm making funny faces, people can see me?
Yeah.
It was saying there wasn't enough room on the card to transfer that.
So apparently the video, it is high definition, but apparently it's more than 2 gigs.
So what's that mean?
Nothing of any consequence, for now anyway. Okay, let's go ahead and do John, okay? So we'll deal with that later.
So-
Don't worry about it.
I'm on to 11.
11:45.
So
10:45 to 11:45.
Oh, 10:45?
as opposed to what do you think it was?
10:30?
You've got 15 minutes between each speaker.
Oh,
That's what you got.
really?
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering that if I have a cord, if we can actually plug this into that laptop and extract.
Yeah.
The question is, do I have one of those cords?
Can you not, what do you have trouble with transferring?
No, I want
It wasn't enough space on that. That's how
to, yeah.
it could take the video and transfer it onto it.
Oh. I need the right cord.
How long is it working out?
Well, there is a way, if you can figure it out. This has Wi-Fi. This has Wi-Fi, and you can upload the videos directly to network utility. Look at this. Select the desired scene. I agree. Okay.
I should have been a teacher.
You should have been?
I should have been a teacher.
For what, writing with the
On my
chalk?
chalkboard writing skills.
Yeah, you should have been.
Okay. We're going to go with John, and we're going to worry about this other business later. Okay. So let's see how we're dialed in here. Okay, great. All right. Say when, John.
When?
When?
When, John?
Did I ask you guys earlier, you guys up front, do you guys have Advil drugs?
Advil?
You have drugs? Advil? Well, I had some Tylenol and that didn't work. So,
Headache?
yeah, a little bit. So if I see them a little subdued, it probably won't last, but if I see them a little subdued,
Low caffeine will help with that.
You ever try Excedrin?
I had some kids. I'm sorry,
Did you ever try
actually,
Excedrin?
Excedrin's fantastic. Yes.
I don't. But that works much better than,
Well, I think this is a tension headache.
yeah.
And it's usually the Advil helps. So, it's probably not a good thing when you're talking about Bible discernment to talk about drugs immediately, but. So, from last year, gosh, seems like an age ago, I discussed the evolution of National Socialism and its direct ties to Christianity. That was fantastic and it was a lot of fun. But one of the things that I didn't get to discuss, and the reason the National Socialism gained so much traction with Christians, was altruism. It's the moral standard of self-sacrifice. So anyway, I'm thinking, yes, this is the direction I'd like to head. And a few months went by, and I happened to be watching some blog conversations, had a series of individual conversations with some people, and the discussion of determinism came up. Now, I know determinism on some level was addressed last year, but I realized that people really struggle to answer the determinist charge. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how many people struggle, which I find fascinating. I find fascinating that in the United States, a nation that has demonstrated rugged individualism, self-appointment, individual purpose, and has demonstrated that it has set the standard for human prosperity and ability across the globe, that we in the United States struggle to answer the determinist charge. And then over the course of the last, politically, I would say 6-8 years, we have seen the undertone and the presumption of determinism in our political class. Not least of which, and we'll get into this in great detail later, is behavioral or environmental determinism. How many over the course of the last few years have you heard people insist that white people can't help but be racist? Well, this is a standard theme within our political class. The white people can't escape their racism. And that as such, the government must necessarily step in to fix what is implicit to their existence. So the more I thought about it, the more I realized really and truly, and of course, when you're talking to any Calvinist, the big elephant in the room, the presumption behind every argument they make, is their predetermined right to dictate doctrine. And that's when I had a series of conversations with Paul, and finally I said, you know what, I'm gonna have to jump into the middle of this. Determinism is not an ancillary question in terms of human existence. The answer to determinism is essential to being able to understand why individuality and freedom are essential. So, that's what I decided to do. Why is determinism such a big issue? Why is it so central philosophically to every tyrannical organization? And I just gave away my question. The issue is tyranny. For those of you who can't see this, I'm hoping that everybody can. Yes, I see it on there. I see you seeing this. This is actually, and I've said this before in other conferences, this is my contribution to philosophy. These are the 5 elements of tyranny. All tyrannical bodies of thought. Can you see me point? Yes, you can. All tyrannical bodies of thought have these 5 fundamental elements. Dictated good. All the doctrines fall into these fundamental categories. Dictated good, universal guilt, the abolition of ambition, collective conformity, and incompetent masses. Now here's how determinism touches all 5 branches. The abolition of ambition. If you have no volition, if you can take no free action, you cannot improve your life. So why try? Incompetent masses. Your incompetence is not your fault. You have no choice. You will be absolved of bad things in your life if you allow those people who are in charge of the utopian prestige to take charge. Universal guilt. Your social sin is part of your nature. We have two options of determinism. We have the secular behaviorists, white racists as an example, and we have the Christian version, which is original sin dictates that you cannot help but sin. So you have a universal guilt that must then ultimately have a dictated good. Somebody must stand up and tell you, because you can't help yourself. We know what's good, so we're going to compel you by force of government. And the last one is called collective conformity. How dare you seek to rise above your station? Don't you know that you can't improve yourself? Don't you understand you are fighting the forces of the universe that have placed you where you belong? Why do you want to stand out from the crowd? Are you proud? Are you arrogant? Don't you understand you're just a sinner? Now, we have in the world, and we're going to discuss this at length, we have two versions of determinism philosophically throughout history. And the first one is the mystic version of determinism. And this is that God controls everything, God is sovereign. And the challenge is that how dare you believe you could improve your life? Because God has appointed you where you belong. And your ambition, remember the abolition of ambition? Your ambition to do otherwise is proof positive of your fundamental metaphysical sinful nature. We have the second version. This came much later in history. Well, actually, that's not quite true. We have the materialist version of determinism. The biology, environment, and natural law determines everything. So the answer to the question of determinism and why it is so essential is because it touches all 5 areas. It is a foundational doctrine for all determinist philosophies. So I said to myself, how do I explain this? How do we figure out how to answer the determinist charge? And I toyed with suggesting that you should get out your Bibles. And I thought some of you would have a heart attack because I've never suggested you get out your Bible. And the answer is no, don't get out your Bibles, because this particular conversation is not satisfied by a scripture stacking debate. It cannot be. You cannot resolve this issue with Bible verses, because the appeal to Bible verses is really the appeal to authority. That's really what this is about. And authority, conceptually, is not a metaphysical premise. You cannot appeal to authority to explain the evolution and value, the structure of philosophy. So since I am not going to discuss the issue of philosophy, I probably should introduce myself. I do this every year at the conference because I think it's very, very important. My name is John Emmel, and I am no one from nowhere. And I say this in deliberate contrast to the important people in the Neo-Calvinist Church who insist that their authority and who they are is essential for why you should actually have to listen to them.
You have not been peer reviewed.
I have not been peer reviewed. That's an inside joke for those of you watching online. I was taken to task on a Wartburg watch that my ideas had not been sufficiently peer reviewed, and because I had not been peer reviewed, I couldn't possibly know what I was talking about. Whatever. I'm here to give you my best rational argument, and because I believe that the nature of independent thinking, free men require valid ideas and validated ideas to arrive at good conclusions, the right conclusions, I'm going to make my best rational argument. And then I'm going to expect you to do what I've always expected, to think, and to decide that if it's true. You are a jury of one in the realm of reason, and it is your job to validate your own ideas. So, having said that, endless, shameless, capitalist plug, I wrote this book that was not peer reviewed, Light in the Vineyard. I got to read my own tagline so I remember it. Exposing the roots, myths, and emotional torment of spiritual tyranny. I wrote this, Well, I wrote it 3 separate times, but this version I think I put out in I've forgotten, 2009, 2010. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This book originally was about Sovereign Grace Ministries, not quite exactly, let me amend. This book discusses Sovereign Grace Ministries as the poster child for the evolution into the Neo-Calvinist movement. But it really isn't about Sovereign Grace Ministries. It's about the doctrines that drove them to their given end. Now, I feel actually very vindicated. While some of this is a touch dated, Paul, I see you have a question on your face.
No, not me.
Okay. Some of this is a touch dated because, of course, now Sovereign Grace Ministries has fallen apart, I think. C.J. Mahaney has traveled to points unknown out of Gaithersburg, Maryland, and the church structure that was Sovereign Grace Ministries has disbanded on some level. I don't know. I do feel vindicated because way back when I was telling the cowards at Covenant Life Church, one of the lead churches in Gaithersburg, Maryland, that C.J. Mahaney was the big dog of that whole reform movement, and he pretty much controlled everything. They poo-pooed me and said, no, that's not true. We have an apostolic team, blah, blah, blah. It was all a joke because at the end of the day, when it really mattered, when push came to shove, C.J. Mahaney proved that no one had the ability within that organizational structure to call him to account. He proved it. So anyway, that was a brief aside. I feel very vindicated and I'm very proud of the fact that I called that probably 20 years before anybody else had the nerve to say so. So for those of you who like the stuff that I talk about, I encourage you to buy my book. It's $23.99 on Amazon. And I will say this, I have not asked for this since I put the book out. And I have gone back and forth in my head. I really wanted the reviews online to be organic. And I have not asked for reviews. But I have been told by people in email and in person that they really like it. But those reviews don't end up online. So I guess I'm going to ask. If you have, and I don't really care. If you don't like what I said, fine, say so and say why. It doesn't really matter to me. Certainly if you have good things to say about me, that'll be nice. I'd like to hear it. But ultimately, I would invite those of you who have read the book and like it, give me a review online. That would be fantastic. It will help. And since determinist ideas are determined, they cannot possibly rebut what I just said because the content of their mind is automatic, right? No. So, here's what I'm going to do in discussing the issue of determinism. To achieve my goal, I'm going to do what I usually do. I'm going to introduce you to the essential philosophical elements impacted by determinism. I'm going to give you a history of determinism. And then, in the last couple lectures, I'm going to give you a rebuttal to the determinist philosophical arguments. Here's what I am not going to do. This is not an exhaustive study. This is merely a survey. We're going to skip over quite a few people, and we're not going to get too deep into how each individual thinker arrived at his position of determinism. This is high-level stuff. And I am not going to reconcile Christian doctrine to the doctrine of free will. And this is probably going to be a big deal for some of you because you're going to want to understand how to address the Calvinists that you meet. We'll get to some of that, but this is not an exhaustive study of scriptures as such. I think the reason I'm not going to do that is because I ultimately think that's a fool's errand. To successfully rebut, Paul opened up his comments today with that we have suffered under the theological academicians for the last, well, since the Reformation. And this is absolutely true. And to gain any real rebuttal to why modern Protestant thinkers think what they think, it will require a full evaluation of canon formation and development. It will require a full evaluation of systematic theology. I put this out as homework online on my blog, asking people to start looking into what systematic theology really is. It is the dominant interpretive practice in conjunction with Luther's interpretive practice. It is the method by which they enforce their particular doctrinal perspectives. And I wanted people to start looking into what systematic theology really was. And without a full evaluation and then a successful rebuttal, it would be almost impossible to explain the distinctions. Its central weakness, the central weakness of systematic theology, and its contrast to the developments after the Enlightenment of higher critical methodology. So that's what I'm not going to do. Flip to slide 2. That is slide 2. So here are some definitions that we're going to actually have some association with. There's a quiz later, so pay attention. Determinism, also known as fatalism. All events are necessitated by previous causes. Mechanistic determinism is natural law determines all causal chains. Behaviorism, environment or genetics determine human action. Theological determinism, God, whichever one you pick, determines human action. We then have it broken down between two versions. Soft determinism. Determinism is true and man, we are morally free. Hard determinism. Determinism is true, therefore there is no human free will. And then the theories related to moral responsibility. Compatibilism. We can be free, morally responsible, even if determinism is true. And incompatibilism. We cannot be free or morally responsible if determinism is true. I told you. What is soft determinism?
Both free will and
Yeah.
determinism. It's really a paradox.
You're exactly right. It is a paradox. What is compatibilism? Anybody?
We can be free or morally responsible if determinism is true.
That's correct. And of course, what is hard determinism? This is going to be the one that we're going to encounter the most. Its variation. What is hard determinism?
Determinism free will.
That's exactly right. That's right. Okay, so we will take a very brief time out while I rearrange my papers. Okay, from the beginning, determinism. Now we are actually going back to primordial. When I'm discussing this, we're going to talk about primordial history. This is, gosh, before 600 BC. This is the Code of Hammurabi and prior. This is the ancient Middle East. This is India before recorded history. And this was an informal. Again, modern philosophy and Western thought does not really start until about 500 BC. So these are loose approximations in as much as we have come to understand them historically. The leading worldly ideas, and I want you to remember, anytime you hear somebody talk about worldly ideas, I want you to put these three things back in your head. These are the top three things that I can have identified up till now. That we see throughout all world religions and world cultures. And these are early variations. Man must sacrifice his existence. Man is a cog in the collective machine, and man's existence is fated by the gods. Whenever you hear somebody pound the pulpit about worldly ideas and trying to make the distinction between biblical ideas and worldly ideas, put this in your head. These three are the most worldly of all worldly ideas on the planet. They have dominated every religion since the inception of man's efforts to solve and ask these questions in his existence. If you care to read some ancient creation myths, Google list of creation myths, just Google it, and it'll come up at a wiki page. Actually, it's pretty good. It'll give you actually a pretty good evaluation. And if you're inclined to check, peer review my stuff, by all means, go ahead and knock stuff out. The generalized theme of these myths: the gods created the world. A hero is confronted with a moral quest. He crosses/encounters the god, the great spirit, or a supernatural being. Man's actions are fated. The gods judge the moral action. The underlying story questions. How close, here's the underlying story questions at large. How close to annoying/challenging the gods can man get without suffering their wrath? The means of assuaging divine wrath are universally, the solution is sacrifice. Destroy a human value to prevent the gods from raining down destruction. Sacrifices range from harvest sacrifices to animal sacrifices to human sacrifices. Sacrifice is a central feature of all religions on the planet. the fundamental presumption is that man must sacrifice some value of his existence to the gods. This has been universal, from the most worldly of all worldly ideas. From our records, these early cultures didn't conceptualize a conflict between free moral agency and divine determinism. It was kind of a given. The conundrum, if you will, they didn't actually make an effort to distinguish. Man was a cog in a cosmic wheel, and Eastern and Middle Eastern sources conceptualize the world as an ongoing causal cycle. And I want you to see this, because this is, this was man's metaphysical framework for almost the entirety of early philosophy. This was man's existence, death, birth, life, old age. And it was specifically related to, and on some level, ancient man had a reason to think this, because he could see this in his life. Winter, spring, summer, fall. And he saw this cycle throughout. And so it really didn't challenge. And this concept is not really centrally challenged until the Jews. The Jews were the first people to have, if you will, 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest. This is one of the earliest forms of a conception, of a linear conception of time. It actually segments man's existence from this cycle and actually puts in man's consciousness a beginning, a progression from work to rest. In other words, man became the center of his existence as he worked, and then he got to celebrate his rest in that existence. That concept does not show up until the Jews. It's actually one of the most profound. The two things that the Jews gave us, the Israelites, is radical monotheism. In other words, you can have no other gods. And this concept, obliterating this concept here, taking this out of our thinking and putting in a linear concept running from work to rest. And man is the center recipient of that. Okay? So now, this worldview, the second people to finally step into the fray and to challenge this worldview is, of course, the Greeks. And they did it very differently than Jewish thought. The Greeks began their formal philosophical investigation circa 600 BCE. This started the conflict between fate, aka determinism, and free will. In the TANC 2013 lectures, Western thought begins with Heraclitus. For those of you who have watched my stuff, I actually took this on in detail in my TANC 2013 lectures, the evolution of Western thought. Because without an understanding of the evolution of Western thought, it is impossible to understand where Christianity starts, what it encountered, and what it has actually become. With Heraclitus, if you will remember, Heraclitus said the world is in a constant state of flux. Existence is nothing but change. Therefore, the world is unknowable. Since man abhors chaos, like nature abhors a vacuum, Western thinkers sought to answer the chaos. They could not abide a worldview that said it really can't be known. They wanted to identify the rules of the world. And the first person to do this was a man by the name of Parmenides. His answer to chaos was, all things are one. Heraclitus, everything is motion, everything changes, nothing is solid. Parmenides says, no, everything is one. Everything is one and it is unchanging. The one is unchanging. And what is eternal. It does not go out of existence. Heraclitus, everything is in flux. There really is nothing. Things go in and out of existence all the time. Parmenides, everything is one. What one is eternal and unchanging. What is this one thing? No one knew. Parmenides then creates the opposite problem. If this is the case, then everything is static. Nothing can move or change or grow. And this, of course, these two ideas stand in contrast to one another. And it's just as unlivable, each solution. The two positions are irreconcilable, and each, in its own way, is unlivable. Enter the Pythagoreans. I would dub these guys the first villains in history, but not really. They didn't mean to be bad. They really genuinely, from their stage and in the evolution of thought, had reasons to believe what they thought, and of course, they gave us music, mathematics. They were impressive people. Their solution, the two worlds. One is in constant flux to satisfy Heraclitus. The other is immutable to satisfy Parmenides. So now we have a third alternative between everything is chaos, everything is immutable, but now reality is divided between two worlds. This is the central point of the soul-body dichotomy, the division of man between spirit and matter. And this is the reason they are ultimately what I would consider philosophical villains. This is the first time we see in human history a formal statement that man is functionally divided. So Western thinkers struggle over these three options until we get to the atomists. And you said 11:45, correct? I like timelines because I want people to see how ideas progress. I want them to understand none of this is in isolation. All of this has something that came before and something that came after. And in every instance, you will see as people go through, they are trying to wrestle with what people have said prior. Yes, you understand? Okay, so the atomists show up, and these people are important to the discussion of determinism. They agreed with Heraclitus, change, process, action, motion is too obvious a fact to deny. So Heraclitus must be right on some level. They agreed with Parmenides. Existence cannot vanish into nothing. Nothing can go out of existence. This is also true. But they rejected the Pythagorean two worlds theory. Here was the atomist solution, and it's actually pretty elegant considering what they knew and when they knew it. They abandoned Parmenides' monism. In other words, everything is just one thing. And they said, now we have many things. The world is made up of many things. But these things have the ability to move. Locomotion does not violate Parmenides' principle because nothing is coming into existence or going out of existence. There is no internal change and no alteration of these individual qualities, but the constant mixing of these things will answer Heraclitus. So we can have change in motion, and we can have something that doesn't go out of existence, and we've actually got a solution to the metaphysical nature of the universe. So what are these things? There were a number of different men who gave answers, but these two men are the ones tied to our current discussion of determinism. The first person is named Leucippus. The second one is named Democritus, and they are come under the subheading atomists. Their theory was so influential that you, have a living almost 3,000 years later, will immediately recognize it. Their theory, everything is made up of particles. The particles move and reorganize, accounting for change. The particles are eternal and never go out of existence. Reality is made up of these particles. Reality is packed so full of these particles that it cannot be cut. What then do we call these particles? The Greek word for uncuttable was atoma. I think I'm pronouncing that. You're the Greek scholar amongst us. Atoma. We'll call it that, right?
Sounds good.
We, of course, call them atoms. Like I said, 3,000 years later, we know more about what they hypothesized almost 3,000 years later, but they turned out to be correct. And here are some Democritus and Leucippus quotes. Sweet by convention, bitter by convention, color by convention, but in reality, atoms and the void alone exist. Leucippus, nothing occurs at random, but everything for a reason and by necessity. The atomist conclusion: all change is nothing but spatial change of atomic position, but atoms are immutable. This solves, of course, Heraclitus, everything is in flux, and it solves Parmenidean problem, everything is eternal. But this raised the next question. How do these atoms operate? What determines how atoms behave? The answer: atomic motion is the result of physical pressure and the impact from one atom and their physical reaction accordingly. Hence was born the billiard ball metaphysic. You can, of course, imagine the pool table, pool ball, pool cue. The interaction of the balls reflect the action of the atoms, and everything operates this way, everything. First, this means that nothing ever happens by chance. There is no causeless action. Everything is determined by the atomic configuration and the various pressures and reactions of mechanical law. Second, and most importantly, there is no teleology. What does teleological mean? Teleological is the assertion that nature, existence, or reality tend toward a final end, or said another way, a final cause is specifically tied to purpose, or meaning and outcome are intertwined. The teleological position: God willed this end. That's a teleological position. The whole of existence has God's intention behind it. Everything that happens for this purpose. The atomists said no. There is no such thing as purpose. This is all mechanistic. So the question is then, does man using the cue have a purpose? And the atomist rebuttal was, man using the cue functions exactly on the same principle as the billiard balls. Man is also called a colliding system of atoms. Atoms collided and caused parts of his body to start quivering, and that caused him to pick up the pool cue and take a shot. Notice the irony. The atomists were trying to solve a fundamental problem between Heraclitus and Parmenides, and ultimately created the first hard determinist theory known to man. They didn't try to do this, but this is ultimately what it ended up being. This branch of determinism is called mechanistic determinism. Remember our pop quiz. You're going to hear this again, because this doesn't go away. Materialism: matter is the fundamental reality, and anything non-material is simply a derivative or byproduct to be explained entirely in physical terms. Mechanism: everything happens according to the laws of mechanics. And if you're interested in my slides, I'll be glad to give them to you. This is in contrast to teleology. That purpose operates in the universe. Religious teleologists say that the universe's purpose is appointed by God. Everything within the universe is infused with divine purpose. What is that purpose? No one knows. Naturalistic teleologists, some part of the universe has a purpose. Living, conscious creatures, or man only. Purposeful behavior is a myth. That the essence of meaning of the metaphysic of purpose and behavior is a myth. There is no such thing. This is the ultimate conclusion of the determinists, the mechanistic determinists. So I want you to understand that mechanistic determinism is the backdrop for everything that comes next. You want to drop that thing yet? Slide over there. 8. Plato. I told you this is a survey, so I didn't dive too heavily into every thinker. So this is a qualification comment as near as I can tell. Plato has nothing major to add to this discussion. He accepts the premise of determinism, but locates the causation of human action in man's character. So basically, it goes like this. Plato offers this explanation. Moral choices are necessary for the soul to achieve a heavenly state in the afterlife. Therefore, the choices are freely chosen, but his character, once acquired, determines his ultimate action and his ultimate end. Here is a quote. I'll let you guys browse this briefly because it's long. I want you to see it again. For those of you online, I'll read this to you in a second. Thus, all things have a part in soul change, for the cause of change lies within themselves. And as they change, they move in accord with the ordinance and law of destiny. If their changes of character are unimportant and few, they are transferred over to the surface of the soul. If they are more, and in the direction of grave wickedness, they fall into the depths and the so-called underworld, the region known by the name of Hades, and the like appellations, which fill the fancy of the quick and the departed alike with dreams of dismay. If a soul have drunk still deeper of vice or virtue by reason of its own volition, and the potent influence of past converse with others, when near contact with divine goodness has made it especially godlike, so surely is it removed in a special place of utter holiness, and translated into another world, another and better world, or, on the contrary case, transported to live in the opposite realm. That was a wordy way of saying that man's character has the ability to send him basically to heaven or hell. Man freely forms his belief system, but once formed, the beliefs are the causes that shape man's character and ultimately determine his eternal state. Plato equates moral action with achievement of eternal damnation or rewards. But the question is, how can you have moral action if human action is determined? Enter Aristotle. Of course, you all know, having listened to my lectures, that I think Aristotle is a philosophical hero. His ideas, he stands, I wish there was a metaphor. He is the Empire State Building of philosophers. But he would be the Empire State Building if no other skyscraper existed. He, on some level, had the benefit of Plato, Socrates. But what he did, what he managed in his time, is unparalleled in human thought. However, having said that, there were a series of errors within his position. Do I think he should be condemned for those errors? Not even close. Part of our problem is we really don't have the sum of Aristotle's thoughts. I mentioned this, I think it was last year or the year before. What we do have of Aristotle is actually pretty narrow, and it's pretty hard to read, pretty hard to get through. So Aristotle did hold a similar view to Plato. He held that human character was the ultimate defining measure of what determines man's existence. Our choices might be predictable, but that predictability is the product of character, and character is man's long-standing action. This is from the Nicomachean Ethics. I don't think I pronounced that right. Somebody can probably explain.
I think that's right. Nicomachean, yeah.
We'll take it.
Nicomachean.
Okay, good. So here's what he said. Still, the inattentive man is himself responsible for having this character by living carelessly, and similarly by being unjust, by cheating, or being intemperate, by passing his time in drinking, and the like. For each type of activity produces the corresponding character. Just as it was up to us to throw a stone, since the origin was in us, but we can no longer take it back once we have thrown it. Similarly, then, the person who is now unjust or intemperate was originally free to acquire his character, so that he has it willingly, though once he has acquired the character, he is no longer free to have it. However, now he is agreeing with Plato, but he is also presuming a substantive free will at the undercurrent, at the foundation of his comment. He presumes that man takes on character, but first he takes on his actions. This is actually not the total sum of Aristotle's thoughts on determinism. He correctly identified that the root of the discussion on determinism was causality. And this is the first time we see causality become a central issue within the philosophical structure. Here's what Aristotle wrote in Physics. We do not have knowledge of a thing until we have grasped its why. Hear what he just said. We do not have knowledge of a thing until we have grasped its why. That is to say, its cause. Notice, and this is a very important issue, Aristotle is making the correct relationship between the identity of a thing and human identification. He is pointing out that the question why is really what is the root of causality. Anytime you hear somebody say why, they are already presuming the root of causation. And they are expecting you to offer validation for the root of causation. Put that in your thinking, because it's actually going to become important, I think, in lecture 3 or 4.
Children do that all the time.
All the time. And the reason is because man has a necessity to understand his existence. Ostensibly, everything that you see is existence. And what makes it understandable is to understand why. What is the cause? Why does this work this way? This is an essential question of human existence. And Aristotle correctly identified this from the beginning. To account for why, Aristotle provided a comprehensive analytical standard. He broke down causes into 4 categories. He broke down causation into material cause. This equals the change or movement which is determined by stuff that comprises the moving or changing thing. This is, for example, a chair will change or move in accord with the stuff of which it is made, wood, stone, or metal. Formal cause, not to be confused with parties requiring tuxedos or dresses. Form. He's saying form, the form of. Wonder Twin Powers, form of. Get it? Remember that? Are you old enough to remember? Who remembers the Wonder Twins? Form of.
Yes, good question.
That's all right. He's affecting my ego. He came up with efficient or moving cause, the factors acting with, against the thing being changed or moved. Example, the efficient cause of a billiard ball being struck by a cue stick, right? And the final cause, the end toward which the thing is directed. Example, a seed acts towards becoming a full-adult plant. And last, Aristotle introduced what he called accidents into the discussion of causality. And unfortunately, this probably causes more problems than it solved. I understand why he did this, but basically accidents for him are chance, or effectively non-causality. Slide 14. Nor is there any definite cause for an accident, but only chance, namely an indefinite cause. It is obvious that there is, this is from Metaphysics, book 5, and this one is from book 6. It is obvious that there are principles and causes that are generable and destructible apart from the actual process of generation and destruction. For if this is not true, everything will be of necessity. That is, if there must necessarily be some cause, other than accidental of that which is generated and destroyed. Will this be or not? Yes, if this happens, otherwise not. Aristotle's summary said there can be a first uncaused cause. There is no definitive cause for an accident. It is possible to trace any sequence of events back to its origin and find an accidental event. And many such causal sequences contribute to events, including human decisions. I want you to remember, why is really the question, what is the nature of the cause? Aristotle introduced chance into existence. Accidents are self-organizing causes, and chance equals indeterminism. Now this is going to cause some metaphysical problems later. The introduction of chance into human action. But I want you to understand this is where it first emerges. So, of course, like I said, we have hard determinism, and the underlying question that we have in Western thought is how can man have a moral requirement if in fact he is determined? And we get to Epicurus. Now, Epicurus really doesn't dominate Western thought, but he does introduce and formalize what Aristotle introduced, as near as I can tell. He said, of course, if man is merely a sum of causation, how can he be held morally responsible? If the world is made up of natural laws, then it follows that man is subject to forces beyond his control, therefore man cannot be held morally responsible. Causal necessity destroys moral responsibility. The question has been implied in all previous discussions, but no one had been given a satisfactory answer. About 40 years after Aristotle, Epicurus offered the solution to the moral conundrum. He accepted the atomist premise. Atoms do move through the void. But to account for free will, he suggested that atoms at random swerve. The swerve was thought to account for atomic collisions. Collisions were thought to be the source of things. The swerve, atoms are dropping down vertically, and they would automatically just go to the left. The swerve is what causes new causal chains. The new causal chain are what preserves human freedom and breaks the bonds of fate. The swerve allows man to be responsible for his actions. I'll let you guys start reading that while I take a brief.
So even with that, even with the swerve, there really is still no choice. It's just whatever happened was because something swerved.
What Epicurus is doing is saying that the only way human beings have an ability to impact their fate is if there is non-causality in existence. That's really what he's saying.
But even that has a cause,
Well, yes.
in a sense.
Right. Which is why we never...
Which is what he's trying. Which is really what he's saying. It's like, it's you just said those swerves is what introduces the ability for us to be able to impact, have an impact, or ultimately a choice.
Right.
But it still comes back to, well, I still didn't really have a choice. My choice only existed because of that swerve that happened, which is no choice.
What was the point earlier? Compatibilism. Ultimately, we're seeing the early versions of this very thing. You have indeterminism and compatibilism together. It is ultimately still determined, and the thing that potentially makes us free is this thing that really doesn't make us free. Hence, the discussion of determinism remains fundamentally unintelligible. Well, you'll see. We'll keep going, and it gets worse. Trust me. Letter from Epicurus, and I do not think I can pronounce this right, Menosius?
Sounds good.
Yeah, okay, good.
We'll go with that.
Chivision.
No, yeah,
Chivision.
Is that how Harry
Chivision.
Yeah,
Is it
Chivision.
Chivision? Is it right?
Like
Chivision.
Right.
Now you can pronounce anything.
Right.
So give that a try again.
Division.
Chivision.
Right.
Menosius? I've got Menosius here, so since I haven't been peer reviewed, it's possible that I'm pronouncing that wrong.
We'll go with that.
Sounds right.
Sounds right? Okay. Okay, so here's Epicurus talking. He's speaking of a wise and virtuous man. Fate, which some introduce as sovereign over all things, he scorns. Now, this being the wise man. Affirming rather that some things happen of necessity, others by chance, others through their own agency. For he sees that necessity destroys responsibility, and that chance is inconsistent, whereas our actions are autonomous. And it is then that praise and blame naturally attach. It were better indeed to accept the legends of the gods than to bow beneath the yoke of destiny, which the natural philosophers have imposed. The one holds out some faint hope that we may escape if we honor the gods, while the necessity of the naturalists is deaf to all entreaties. Nor does he hold chance to be a god, as the world in general does. For in the acts of a god there is no disorder, nor to be a cause, though an uncertain one. For he believes that no good or evil is dispensed by chance to men, so as to make himself blessed, though it supplies the starting point of great good and great evil. He believes that the misfortune of the wise is better than prosperity of the fool. It is better, in short, that what is well judged in action should not owe its successful issue to the aid of chance. I want you to notice how hard man starts to resist the premise that his determined action makes him morally responsible. Man implicitly understands that this is a fundamental injustice. He implicitly understands that if his actions are determined, whether by the naturalists or the gods, it either absolves man of moral action, or man is now, he actually has no ability to achieve anything in his own right. He rejects this, but this is actually is not what dominates. Even though he is trying to make an effort at philosophical justification for free will, he, of course, falls short. He cannot divorce the two. It does not solve the problem of necessity. It's not even close. At a minimum, it raises these questions. Since swerves are random, how do these explain free action? Which is effectively what you were saying. How does a swerve ultimately explain free action? What does it mean? Does that mean atoms randomly swerve before every free action? How can free action happen with regularity? As predicated on human moral choice. Effectively, you would have to have a swerve at the encounter of every moral choice in human existence. Where do you get that? And then, because if it happens, and if swerves happen frequently, how come then stones and trees and other inanimate objects, why can't they suddenly start doing free action? Of course, since this did not solve the problem, the next people to come up were called the Stoics. Introducing chance into existence is really the same as introducing non-causality into existence. And the moment we introduce non-causality, suddenly the 3- or 5-year-old question of why suddenly becomes, I don't know. The reason we can answer the question why is because ultimately we can identify the causal chain, so we can actually dissect it such that the 5-year-old can understand the relationship between A, B, C, and D. The moment we say non-causality, then A doesn't necessarily follow B, and we're back to an unintelligible Heraclitus, everything is flux and change world. The Stoics rejected the premise, rejected, of course, what Epicurus tried to introduce. And we have a guy by the name of Chrysippus. Again, don't know these Greek names, but we'll go with it. Crispy chicken, is that what you just said? Oh, shoot.
Chrysippus.
Yeah, okay, good. We'll go with that. Crispy chicken, that's cute. All right. Everything that happens is followed by something else which depends on it by causal necessity. Likewise, everything that happens is predicated by something with which it is causally connected. For nothing exists or has come into being in the cosmos without a cause. The universe will be disrupted and disintegrated into pieces and cease to be a unity functioning as a single system if any uncaused movement is introduced into it. Brief editorial note. For those of you thinking about neo-Calvinists, where have you heard that logic before? I believe it's John Piper that says if God's not in control of just about everything, if he's not in control of everything, if he's in control of not one atom, it all destroyed, right?
R.G. Sproul.
Is that Sproul?
R.C. Sproul.
R.C. Sproul? You see where he gets it? There really is nothing new under the sun. The Stoic solution was natural law controls everything. Every event has a cause, and that cause necessitates the event. Even exactly the same, given the exact same circumstance, exactly the same result occurs. Now, I want you to understand something here. If that isn't true, we have no modern science. Given the same set of circumstances, the same factors, the exact same result occurs. This is the basis of modern science. And it is our ability to identify all the factors that determine all the relationships that ultimately produce the same action and the same outcome. This is what Francis Bacon 101. And it was this ability to understand this that made what we do in the modern world possible. The central issue here is they apply this ultimately to human action. Human beings are just as determined, just like Democritus already told us. This is really what human beings, this is the lot of the human existence.
So, if I may, coming into play here is the obvious fact that man has shown himself able to identify elements and manipulate them.
Correct.
And make them work together to bring about cause and effect results.
Yep.
Okay, so in helping me keep up with this, what's the direct contrast in your words to the prior? What these other guys are saying. Natural.
Naturalists?
Yeah, natural, so on and so forth.
Well, okay, hold that. I want you to keep that thought in mind because what you just said ultimately is Sir Francis Bacon's premise.
Okay.
Nature to be commanded is to be obeyed. Man does not, when he interacts with the world, he does not bring anything into existence, he merely rearranges what is to his own advantage. This is a modern concept. We don't get, see my timeline here? We don't get to where you're going until this direction. Man has to learn some things before this happens. As of right this minute, everybody pretty much prior to here has said man has no ability to impact the world. Or his ability to impact the world is very narrow. Does that help you?
Well, yeah, up in what you're saying during this time, there's no ability to impact.
Correct. Now, I haven't, trust me, we'll get to rebuttals and where I think we fit and how I think this works later.
Okay.
Okay? Okay, so the Stoics. Now, I do want you to keep this in mind, and I made this point. I just stepped out of camera. Did I? No, I'm shouting. Stoicism. Here, remember, this is the world in which Christianity expands. Keep this in mind because it matters when we're coming up, what's coming up next. Okay, so we have them, they've successfully identified that given the exact same circumstance, exactly the same results will occur. This is a good thing, but man is still morally responsible no matter what. Chrysippus, crispy chicken. I just feel like I said that in kindergarten. Chrysippus is our first compatibilist. You remember from my definitions, compatibilist. Determinism exists, but man is still morally culpable. Determinism exists, man is still morally culpable. Keep this in your head because it actually becomes very important here in a minute. The central issue, morality and determinism. Now, did I give this? I don't remember if I actually put it. It is just as if you throw a cylindrical stone across. Is this actually a repeat of?
No.
No, this is not it. It's just if you throw a cylindrical stone across a region of ground, which is sloping and steep. You are the cause in the beginning of the headlong fall for it. But as soon as it rolls headlong, not because you are now bringing it about, but because that is how its fashion and capacity for rolling in its shape are. Just so the order and rule and necessity of fate sets types and beginnings of causes in motion, but the impulse of our minds and the deliberations and our actions themselves are governed by each person's will and by the nature of our minds. And men suffer woes that they choose themselves. This is a reiteration of what I just said. This is his words on how he addresses the issue. Determinism exists. Fate set things in motion, but man is responsible for the content of how he acts in context of fates. So the Stoic metaphysic is complete determinism. The Stoic logic is fate equals nature equals natural law equals God. Now I want you to understand, the Stoics are advancing one of the first real mystical versions of determinism. Nature, natural law, is really God in their minds. Up until now, it's been mostly agnostic. It's been Western Greek culture. While they believed in the gods, they were not theocrats. Their philosophy was born as effectively primarily man-centered, secular, if you will. The Stoic logic is effectively the first advancement of a theological version of determinism, in a formal sense. Everything is governed by fate. Fate equals nature, nature equals natural law, and that equals God. They identified with the sequences of causes. Nothing could happen otherwise than it does in any given set of circumstance. One and only one result can follow. The past is unchangeable, but possible future events do not occur by necessity from past external factors alone. Factors shaping events also include man's action. We have a choice to assent or not to assent to an action. Man's actions are determined by the nature of our character and 3 more pages. I'm almost close. I told you I was going to try to play message here. Man's actions are determined by the nature of our character and fated because of divine foreknowledge. But future events are not necessitated, i.e. predetermined by the past. Okay.
Just to kind of put things in context here, going back to our study of the book of Acts, because you're getting into the Christianity Greek world. These were the exact same people that Paul encountered.
These are the exact same people
on Mars Hill.
Exactly.
Because from my own study and preparing that particular lesson from chapter 17, I think it was, Epicurean thought had dominated culture, was the dominant thinking for a length of time.
Yes.
And the Stoics were trying to make inroads into that. And so Paul steps right into the middle of this conflict between the Epicureans and the Stoics. And they want to hear what he has to say about it, and he turns them both upside down.
What Andy is actually, Andy's comment fits exactly into this timeline. This is what I want you to see. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Christianity has a tendency to believe that it was born out of whole cloth, kind of came out fully formed outside of God's head and landed in men's minds. This is just not true. I want you to understand, I'm going to step out of camera range again. Okay, the Pythagoreans, remember what I said they were known for? What was it? Pop quiz. Soul-body dichotomy. Yes? The division of man's material existence with his spiritual existence. Yes? Okay. Now, we have a resurgent sophistic movement, a resurgent cynic movement, and a resurgent Pythagorean movement. All of these are occurring right around the time we have the rise of Christianity. And what Andy just said is exactly right. When Paul shows up on Mars Hill, and in fact, it wouldn't have mattered if it was Mars Hill or the local streets in Jerusalem. Ultimately, Paul intellectually had to compete with these dominant worldviews. And Paul would not have been anywhere close to the intellectual mainstream, not even close. He actually has some cynic influence in his doctrine and his sophic ideas in his doctrine. Whatever you want to do with that, I'll let you decide. But ultimately, this is the world in which Christianity begins to emerge. I discussed this at length in my 2013 lectures. You remember that by the 2nd century, Plato, Aristotle have faded. The dominant philosophical thought throughout the Western world is the Stoics, the Cynics, and the Skeptics. I didn't put the Epicureans in here, but Andy is correct. So we have these resurgent movements right around the time of Jesus, right here. Remember, the physical body is corrupt, and the material world is corrupt. This is the Pythagorean influence. The denial of the flesh is an existential ideal. The physical body prevents man from taking moral action. Asceticism, meaning the flesh destruction of the flesh, is a virtue. Beating yourself, starving yourself, don't take a bath, that kind of thing. The Cynic and Stoic ascetic ideal has become the Christian ideal. This is what happens through this time period and coming forward. The ascetic ideal becomes the Christian ideal. And that is specifically and directly Cynic and Stoic. The soul, the spiritual, and the otherworldly is good. Man's fleshly world existence is evil. Man has no ability to change. So now we see, effectively, this has started to metastasize. Right here. What was a mystical version of determinism starts to metastasize, and the gap between man's physical existence and his spiritual existence grows wider and wider and wider and increasingly more hostile. This is the background. This is the backdrop. And I'm going to use these next two men, Lucian of Samosata and Alexander of Aphrodisias. I wanted to put these two guys in here because I wanted you to see a contrast. And these are not Christian thinkers. We are in, this is 120 to 210 AD, okay? This is in this area right through here, okay? These are not Christian thinkers. This is not the dominant worldview. But these are pagans, if you will, who are still struggling with the dominant thought that I'm showing you here. And here's what they had to say. Lucian of Samosata. This is actually an entire discussion, and I just pulled one section out of it. This is actually on spiritualtyranny.com. That's my blog. I didn't introduce that at the beginning. I do run a blog, spiritualtyranny.com, and I talk about this stuff at some length. I posted Zeus Catechized online because I wanted people to see it in its total context. And so here's what he had to say. Now, Lucian, I'm not sure it's even right to call him a philosopher, but he's a thinker of his day, and he's a social commentator, and so he has written effectively this play. And Cyniscus is talking to Zeus. And he says, why we men do nothing of our own free will. We are obeying an irresistible impulse. That is, if there is any truth in what we settled just now about fates being the cause of everything, does a man commit murder? Fate is the murderess. Does he rob a temple? He has her instructions to do it. So if there is going to be any justice in Minos, in Minos' sentence. He will punish destiny, not that person, Sisyphus? Sisyphus. He will punish destiny, not Sisyphus, for heaven's sake. Sisyphus. Fate, not Tantalus. What harm do these men do? They only obey orders. Notice, and again I want to reiterate, he is a non-Christian, and in the early age of Christianity, even the pagans see the crucial failing of the deterministic metaphysic. Determinism makes a mockery of justice. And here is Alexander of Aphrodisias. I don't think I actually have anything for you. He also wrote during this time period, his purpose was to attack the Stoics' strict determinism. The Stoic worldview was encompassed by a materialist cosmology, the atomists, governed by the God of nature. Nature's God had foreknowledge of all causal chains, and as such, predetermined the whole of human action. Alexander said that fate was nature, and that nature only held power over species. Notice he is trying to remove the mystical power from nature. He's trying to make he's trying to divide it. As such, nature cannot have foreknowledge. I don't know Greek, but it is my understanding that the Greeks do not have a word for free will. I know, Andy, you like Greek roots, so is that true? Do you know? Yeah, it's my understanding they don't have a word for free will specifically. What they use, there is a word that means, that is translated, what depends on us. And this becomes, what depends on us is a choice between alternatives. Alexander is arguing that man is responsible for self-caused decisions and can choose what actions to take. The question then becomes, in the history of determinism, what depends on man? Now, as you can see, we are poised in my big movement, in my big target. We are about ready to discuss these three right here. Well, Augustine, and in conjunction to Plotinus. You Buddhist thought, yeah, you should. It only gets darker from here. And I did good. I did good, I think. What time is it? Almost 12. 15 minutes over. Okay, well, thoughts, comments, knock-knock jokes, what?
It takes time for me to digest these philosophical ideas. It's because it's almost as to prove this argument here. It's like in circles sometimes, a lot of times. But in all my reading of Jonathan Edwards, all the hours that he spent in study, he was not spending that time studying the Bible. He was very knowledgeable in these philosophers. And the more you talk, the more I see that man and how he picked and plucked and formed and molded doctrine for the church.
Yes.
From these philosophers.
Yes, they did.
And claimed that they were directly from God.
Correct.
And that they were to be obeyed.
Yes. This is one of the reasons that I make such an effort to show you the progression of thought. One of the reasons that Paul and myself and others who take on this stuff have such a hard time is because most people fail to grasp that Christianity did not show up fully formed in the world. Its roots, Christianity, forgive me for being so blunt, has been masterful at pretty much taking whatever it wants from whatever tradition it wants.
You talk about Christianity as we know it today.
Yes, Christianity as we know it today. Will plagiarize whatever it wants for any reason it wants and turn it into a sanctified doctrine. And I'm trying to rip the mask off of that. I'm trying to show you that this stuff did not show up fully formed out of full cloth out of the side of God's head and dumped in our heads. It's just not how that worked. It has very serious roots going all the way back to the beginnings of Western thought. And Christianity as we know it gets this is my first major historical villain. The fact that he is considered a saint is an atrocity. It's an intellectual atrocity.
That's the reason why I assert that we need to drop the term Christianity, because what we know as Christianity today is not what you've got there in the green box there, Christianity expands into the Greek world. That is not what Jesus introduced into the world following his crucifixion, when those 120 disciples left that upper room after the Holy Spirit descended upon them and they went out. That is not what Jesus had in mind.
I would agree, but the philosophical development, see, here's what never happened in Christianity, and I've said this before. Here's what never happened. There was no philosophical, what happened in the upper room had no philosophical standard. It could not succeed, it could not prevail in this environment, because it cannot answer, it cannot rebut these issues. And one of the reasons that Paul had such a hard time on Mars Hill is because he didn't have a framework within which to put this. What happens day of Pentecost here has no ability to compete with what happens here. By the time we get to the patristics, which is 70, 80 years after Jesus, the church fathers, what are known as the church fathers, are already confronted with an onslaught of Hellenistic thought. And they did not have a means or an ability to do this. A generalized house-to-house movement, this is one of the biggest problems behind the whole house-to-house movement. It has no framework, which is why universally what happens is that revivals go, okay, we got this thing kind of going, but now what does this all mean? And they need a framework, and so they start looking back here.
I don't know that would necessarily be, that I would necessarily fault Paul for that. I don't think that he was necessarily, I don't think that the fault lies with him not necessarily having a philosophical framework. I think it goes back to, I think there's another motivation behind it. Paul was simply saying, look, here is how what Jesus says fits into reality, but these guys were looking at a different reality.
Well,
and because of that, there was other motivations behind it, whether it be power, influence, authority, whatever. They weren't willing to, they wanted to hang on to whatever they had, and so they had a philosophical framework that supported what they wanted. And the reason they butt heads with Paul is because they were coming from, Paul was saying this, and these guys were saying, well, Paul, what you might be saying might not necessarily be true, but we reject it because it doesn't fit in with what we want.
Well, for the first, I will say this, for the first 110 years or so, Paul was considered a heretic. Paul doesn't make it in the canon. This is very ironic. I think it was a guy named, I can't think of his name.
Because there were several guys.
Who was the first guy that actually suggested canon? He gets about 150, 160 AD. I can't think of his name. He's ultimately condemned. He was condemned as a heretic. But he was the first person to bring Paul into canon.
What you see happening on Mars Hill, though, is after their discussion, after most of those guys dismiss Paul as a lunatic, Paul walks away, but there are several who come to him afterwards and said, hey, we like what you had to say. In fact, we are convinced with what you have to say. But they say it to him in secret because they don't want to be seen with him. Because they know if they do, they're going to be ostracized.
Sure.
So Paul presented a reasonable, convincing argument that there were those who believed him and followed after him. The ones who did not, those who were not reasonably convinced, were not so because it did not fit in with their premise.
Well, it didn't actually, this right here, what Paul had to say did not answer any of these primary thinkers. That was the substantive problem. And of course, this is why Christianity, for the most part, flounders through this time period. It doesn't have the ability to impact the larger world philosophically. So by the time we get to Augustine, the church is in full tilt boogie, trying to find a framework within which that it can. And ultimately what it does is Augustine co-opts Plato.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, in all of these constructs, I don't see a whole lot of difference between Plato's idea of immutable forms, okay, versus the shadow world. You still have that dichotomy of all material is evil and only the invisible is good, with the assumption that all that is invisible is immutable, by the way, right? Okay, now, Plato assumed, now I don't know if Plato put the invisibility in there and put the pure forms together with that was invisible. I'm not sure about that. You probably know more about that than I
Well,
do.
that's the central premise behind idealism in general.
Uh-huh.
That this mystical spiritual world is the location of creation, and we somehow get this shadow down here.
Yeah. But obviously, though, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, the pushback in that is the idea that atoms being invisible, if they're, you have all of this different kinds of interactions going, obviously atoms are mutable. Okay? How does that fit into Plato?
I don't know that it does.
Okay.
I don't know that it does. Actually, unfortunately, we've got your question really, there's nothing back in this direction that answers that.
Okay.
We've got to get to the Enlightenment before we ever come close to being able to address what that means. So any other comments, thoughts? Guys hungry?
We are. I'll do a quick overview of what we've got coming up next, and we are gonna eat and
Drink and be merry.
eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow we die.
Sleep this.
Yeah, and so yeah, we're gonna break for lunch. We'll be back at I believe we have to be back by 1 because we got a link set up. So we'll be closing out the Google group live broadcast for the morning session. We do have some folks that requested to be a part of the afternoon session, probably because John made them mad. And so
No.
it was during John's session. We got at least one email, sign me up, sign me up. So we might have some participation there in the afternoon. And so with that, we'll break for lunch, and we have to be back by 1 because we do have the link set up for people joining us on Google Hangouts. And with that, we'll break.
If you want to leave and go somewhere, come back for lunch, you may, but this is called, thanks to my precious person back there, Shannon and Blaine, the grandbaby, the grand big boy, because he's in kindergarten now. It's the Susan Subway back there. So it's all kinds of stuff you can make a sandwich out of. That's unsweetened iced tea. There's Coke and Diet Coke in the refrigerator. There's water in the refrigerator. Coffee pot's still plugged in. There's probably coffee syrup by now. If you want me to make a fresh pot, I can. There's you can eat, drink, and whatever, or you can munch.
I've got to run to the house and get a SD card.
Oh, okay.
You need a flash drive? Or you need an SD card?
That's SIM card.
I don't know.
The space where I could had it on the wireless. I got the part where I could have it on the camera as a wireless.
Did I hear?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sorry. Okay, you're fantastic.
Oh, polar
Actually,
bear,
I got Tom, I
1957.
was looking for some evidence.
I've got one more if you need.
So you can download the videos from the camera without a card? That'll save me a trip. That's
What, did you find one?
He thinks he can download it directly from the camera. Oh, what did you find, the Wi-Fi that the camera puts out? I might have the cord. The cord's back in the house.
Think of all the combinations.
I think he's gonna try to download it to the laptop with Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Okay. I have regular mustard if you don't want sticky mustard. This is a little spicy. And we're not so.
What kind of bread do we have?
There is the whole wheat bread, there's croissant, there's sesame, brioches.
Yeah.
Great. He was hoping to be here at noon. So you got a late
You're
start.
fired. Probably that concert.
That's right.
But he said he was gonna try and listen in.
And watch out for the cheesy paper dividers. There's mayo. And they-
Where's the horseradish?
I didn't bring horseradish. Do I need to run home?
No, you do not need to run.
Failure.
Stadium must go with that.
Failure. Let's see. There's this whole grain bread, there's brioche, there's sesame, there's croissant. Sesame.
What is this tea here?
That, this is turkey.
Oh, okay.
And the fruit is still over here if you want fruit. Oh, I know what. If people want iced tea, we can put some ice in that bowl. Oh, these big pickles are jalapeno pickles and they are hot. But they're really not a surprise. Well, the last time I served those.
What kind of, I'm sorry, what kind of cheese is this?
Well, the round is provolone, the square is mozzarella, and the one with holes in it is cheese. That's good.
That's kind of what I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, this is yeah, I'm not.
Oh, okay. I'll come and see you next. Right.
Okay. I wasn't gonna have a tea back here. I'm right there. Think. What about bowls? Bowls. I think
in your birth.
Oh, no. I love it. You'll have to be for tomorrow. Maybe.
It's not picking it up, is it? I'll run and get that. Send this card real quick.
Further sparkling water, if you don't help yourself.
All right.
You like these?
You want any drink a lot of honey?
I saw you guys drinking the flavor.
Yeah, the flavor.
It's
either that nowadays or tea. Because, I kind of lost the desire. Okay, she goes over there.
I know I'm good at trying to figure out what you like.
Onions.
Onions are
Oh,
the
wait, then I'll vote for onions.
very offensive. Thank you.
I mean, her head.
You just have to keep your distance, right?
But you know what, this is my gripe with school education, whether it's homeschool, Christian school, public. This needs to be taught, starting like in third or fourth grade.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And because it can be taught in such a way that can be understood or not. There are ways to explain this. Then by the time that they are in high school, you can get into the more complicated logic. This is one of the things that was taught in universities during the period time, rhetoric and logic. They studied this so they could confound the people that they were preaching. And look around because they're looking very adept at taking ideas and turning them whithersoever they wanted to accomplish what they wanted their congregations to accomplish. Edwards was a master's in psychology. And so analyzing the right. People ignore that.
Have you ever read Everything Hangs in the Gut?
Oh, not the word. My husband, memorize the whole thing?
Well, I was going to echo what you were saying. It was masterful.
Oh, it was. I said, put this place to find it. Forget that. You know, and you know, that wasn't because well, he fulfilled it. Delivered it 40%. And changing according to his audience. Changing certain parts of it. And certain metaphors, certain examples from whoever he was bringing it to. And he was in an agrarian or an agrarian type of congregation, and he used his illustration to be more agrarian.
What's more
If they were more urban, he changed it to more urban. And if you want more, you got to know. And this is what all of that. Yeah, that's.
Oh, boy.
That's what got me on it. Yeah. Actually,
So I'll take these so I can get that, yeah.
this was the door process. It was rough,
Well, I just got locked out and Andy had to come rescue me.
but, I have to go in, I'll be over there. But, you need to be careful, you don't, I'll let him know you can't. Well, I don't really do the house if I can. But when I saw his script, okay, this person, you read what's before, and you read what's after. Oh, yeah, and use the word combination. This is the first, this is the future.
Yeah, well, but, and I'm like, the Lord is so much the truth is so great. All right, beside all this sugar, and he didn't have one thing to do with the point. Put it in there to validate what.
But Susan, that's what every pastor at a seminary does.
This is the point I'm making.
Because it's not about the context. It's about interpreting that verse in its helpful context.
Well, I looked at that whole chapter of Deuteronomy, which is a song of Moses, one of the songs, one of the four songs. It was right before death, before it told the door, God. But anyway, the part of the verse that, and which the feet shall slide in slippery slope. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to go to Christian. There's nothing what is taught in synagogue? What are the Jewish rabbis? How do they teach this? You know, that almost all Jewish commentators say this is a statement by God against his enemies, not against the nation of Israel. That God would see that if the enemies were on a slippery slope and were going to be the danger of God's wrath. He also mentioned in this chapter that he was upset with the ungodliness of people, and that there would be consequences for that, and etc. But that portion of scripture is not to the enemies, not to the nation of Israel. I brought all my books over there. I was showing people. I was flipping through and I go, uh-oh, I left some of my bookmarks. You can see where I was reading and studying Sunday. I was having to seize the day. No, I was marking places in the book because that's, when you get up to go to work for a while.
Now, are those reference materials? Are those all things that are written
By him?
against Edwards or in favor of him, or are they just like biographical studies?
So some of the biographical I had to gag on.
What about one in his wife's letter?
There is the Uncommon Union. I read a biography of her.
I know.
Which
Also make sure this one meets. That was in the
yes.
I have to give Sarah credit.
She was married to an author. And this is one thing, that woman, they had 11 children. And she managed that household. And she taught those children. And she did. I know she had help. But when she had her people there at the house, she had her little first head. I read it in an article after I read it. I thought, no, I think I like this approach to understanding why she behaved that way when it was free. Rather than discuss everything. So overwhelmed with the word,
She had a feeling emotional breakdown. And then her husband comes back and psychoanalyzes.
If you don't ever married to a difficult man,
well, no, somebody,
or
And that's her, what,
Her letter.
yeah, her letter. Which, by the way, she wrote her testimony of what happened during that away murders. And her husband came back. He had her, he wrote it and then published it. He took her name out of it and changed all references to her and altered it a little bit in order to shape it to the point that he wanted to make about the awakening. And some
He made it form that his
yeah.
precepts.
His, you know, 'cause I don't want to, I'm not, that's part of my problem. But next year, I've already said, if I'm doing this next year, I am not doing these Puritans. Those men, I have slept with the Puritans long time.
They're evil.
Well, once I started all this reading with Jonathan Edwards, you know, and everything, physical thoughts, I'm in bed with 2 men because every thought I have will be this.
That's why you probably haven't slept well since you started studying.
Oh, I haven't. And that's what and it's because I get to know and I read this book, I followed that all the time. I'm gonna read it. I was crying. I was so angry. I was crying. How dare this man write this? And I'm going to share that portion. How dare fashion God way to accomplish something for his own ego, because your success as a pastor was determined on how many awakenings the church had and how long they stuck. And he always blamed it on God when he didn't stick. The student Protestant. It's like, hey, God arrived, now God's leaving. And look who's in the house. Yeah.
The quote by Lucian, he jumped out, and he said, because I watch a lot of stuff, not theater. It just screams not theater. Not theater.
Well, anytime you have fruit, you're going to have gnats. So.
Do you remember the quote? You probably can't quote it verbatim, but basically removes the responsibility from man.
Oh, yeah, you don't do dinner or anything.
Anyway, it just yelled at me.
So, I mean, I try to plan for things like that. I have work.
What we're experiencing again today,
Now or
here,
later.
and as you guys know,
I'll leave them there.
we'll see on the parallel. It's
You have a big family.
fascinating and frightening at the same time. That people
No, that's, I'm gonna put,
that
I'm gonna need it.
that one quote.
This
I
is
guess
the second.
so next.
It's the same thing that happened with the good hospital.
I don't do it for one of the, it's got a broken one. There's one out in the hallway.
They're not equipped.
Oh, that
They
one is
outsource
not.
their brains.
Yeah, excited about it.
Looking for
For
Yeah, I just need to lay.
that there's
But I
a
have to
door on the
have a-
door leading into the door. That's more. And that's what they'll go.
I forgot about that.
They'll do the little study, have the little question and they at the end of each section.
I have to do that.
She's a white mystic.
I'm very proud of you. I appreciate myself. I was brainwashed. A little bit love, a little bit trouble.
Our former blueberry
It's hard to do in a long run.
and
We're being very occupied.
anyway, he writes books like that. And he used to stand up and say, read five. The problem is, no, I there no. People aren't going to go. It's kind of giving lip service. Don't believe me, right here, go home and read your stuff. No one's advising you to go home and read it.
It's actually, I always found it fascinating. It's documented. It's almost. He takes an enormous amount of money. Now, yes, I understand the order. They go read and try to understand why they apply the process. It's an enormous amount. And so they feel like you're most of the habits that yourself. And actually, that doesn't control what it really means. Here's this commentary question.
Or what they'll say is, go read it yourself, knowing that they'll read it, they won't understand it. The try to get is that, just, they just take the word for it, like the whole church.
And nod along and say, wow, how learned it
I
is.
don't agree with you. Yeah, they'll say, the church divides all this stuff.
I remember it was just on the highway. Avoid highway. Highway.
That's why you use your phone.
I need to, and,
No, once you call, I was trying.
I'm on stage, got a few rules.
That's your. You got to be right. I have to have visual. Okay, Mr. Kerr.
calculated.
Yeah, calculated. I'd rather just this is on, I'm not going straight. And then my phone is like.
I remember when I first got there, they hadn't been shown. They were charismatic, church.
Was it because they're,
The advantage of that is that they came off as interesting socialist regime, and very easily charismatic renewal well off. So they seem like a very in the context of that. I was frustrated. So I ended up on their doorstep. So by the time I see it starting to roll out, I mean, my degree is just university. The theology part is so cool. So I already long since decided this was, I reject.
I mean,
They were getting close. Oh, yeah. And they were massive.
like different people that have.
What is a tag team effort? Once they realize that only one person can hold you down, and they get over it. It was the early stages of the reform transfer.
That's what we did in the conversation.
And
You can do that.
we're in my character reader, my parents,
It was moist and
and Ellen Hoffman, all 7 or 8 times, Ellen Hoffman is the director.
Strawberry.
That's just on it. So what happens and she goes, no, that's not.
I actually need to make before and had them turn it over to them.
And then she goes, you're just trying to proselytize. And I tried to give an explanation.
So I gotta get.
And she goes, you're just trying to proselytize people.
All kind of.
And I come to explain the question.
I think he did.
If she could not make the transition.
I have.
And the fun thing was, and Ellen did it for example.
Yeah.
And they could not see it coming. It wasn't until like the parents they would make sure. Because at first it was pretty immature. Well, they hit it well. The priest of doctrine without really good precision. I remember the first time I said it, I thought, oh, this is that's I pointed out every time. I was shouting.
Or they feel like they have.
I wasn't applauding them more than it was in see, I was shouting down the car. Because they didn't want to get enough. They would turn it. And so the day, yeah, I remember when I was sitting in Rosenberg, I was in 1,000. Pretty much any kerfuffle there was.
I'm not that word, by the way.
You were the troublemaker.
Oh, I was. And I got like, they were, so I was the husband who couldn't keep his sister in his house.
My name is Miss Mom.
So yeah, so I end up in council session. So finally he said, John, you have to get on it. And I said, yeah. Yeah, well, you gotta understand, but when he said this was a revelation. This was the first time ever openly started to tell us something.
The small one, they're like, yeah.
So the funny thing was, they gave me all this crazy stuff. Because I said, you have this delegated. Then of course, delegaries and which was really hilarious because I think it was because John, why don't you just instruct your and I said, Robin, you just said that I was delegated. So you want me to go start my own church so I can have people with their constructive influence on others? I mean, at the time, I was like, I mean, at the time, it wasn't really fun. Later, I think.
Is that what they did? Did they leave from?
Oh, yeah, I kind of like church was born of a church. I mean, they like to pretend they were in the center of the origin, the epicenter of Roman system.
And we've had that same response.
And then after the rain outside.
You guys have it all figured out.
Yeah.
There's always that. Oh, yeah. Obviously, all these pastors for all these hundreds of years have had it wrong. And so you
got it right.
I mean, there's always that.
After postings.
Yeah.
It's so constant.
No, then I let it go out and run.
And actually, it's a compliment because the Bible talks about the remnant. And the road, the highway that hell is high and broad.
Right.
I mean, that's one way to paraphrase.
Over this way.
I mean, it's not easy to walk out there. Oh, well, I mean, reform theology,
Well, no, they didn't say you won't hear the reform. They said the pastor is a staunch Calvinist, the staunchest Calvinist you'll ever meet, but you'll never hear that preached in the pulpit, which was a big fat lie. Yeah, if he's a staunch Calvinist, it's coming through. It's just not coming through in blatant. He's not saying, here's 5 points, here's the tulip. It's just coming through in nuance.
You know what the ironic part about that is that most of these guys identify themselves as Calvinists.
Don't even know what the Calvinist is.
That kills me. That kills me.
And they're the biggest advocates against the whole neo-Calvinist movement. Although they can't stand the neo-Calvinist movement because it's contrary to what they think Calvin taught. What they don't realize is exactly what Calvin taught.
Well, I think they all have,
I don't work with my work tomorrow. And I he wrote the book, and Jesus played anything with them. And even Jesus played nothing there. I mean, they both started just going at it, but anyway, just want to in and not to do that. It's a 3 to 9.
although William
Division.
salvation
The first thing
is probably a lot more honest
Then
than
you
probably
would be
Calvinist.
Oh, yes.
They're blatantly Calvinist and not the first. So he's like, I'm a Calvinist and, you know,
He's not the nuance of the realist.
yeah.
Because of nuance in it.
No, he's got his tattoos on his guns and he, you know, does selfies with his totally
I mean,
sweet selfies with his shirt unbuttoned down to here.
it's ugly as sin. That's what they call it.
But he thinks he's
He does, but I tell you, I look at, I go.
What is it?
nothing.
He was telling you.
Look on my shirt. I mean, I wonder if I could
Well, the one thing that you got to you look at the hierarchy, sin hierarchies, in sex and stealing money. So they can talk about these things at home. You can't steal money, you can't. So this one. And then, I mean, eventually,
Bring him right back into the fold.
Bring it right back. So, could be
The
back.
best year of the
He
story.
will.
Could be
How
back.
would you go?
Could be back with, some good story about how
Especially if you, I don't know.
Well, and the thing is that they don't understand the doctrine. I think they got the T and
Oh, that's a
figured
weird
out
look.
literally. The total depravity part. They're always the first to know.
See, that, the thing there is, that whole tulip across the street came from Simon Tulip. Isn't it? Yeah. That's not Calvinist.
Well, this is the lie we just effectively expect now is that pretty much everything has, the whole component is Calvinism. Now, what the Senator Florida is trying to edge some of that.
The Senate being from the Lutherans, right? The Senate from the Lutherans.
I would have to actually, I
Indirectly, but.
don't think there is a school, Lutheran church does.
Okay.
It's them trying to, it's that age, because they were actually getting some reasonable pushback.
I have a little grandmother.
And there's some central holes in Luther's content. And they were getting hammered. And there's some challenges. And so they had the synod method to try to reconcile some problems. And the tulip was actually a response to some of their So, but Calvin is still the plumbing. I don't care how long, you can, this is the plumbing. I don't care if you're Senator Door or Westminster Confession. I don't really care where you land. At the end of the day, this is your plumbing. And so coming forward, anytime you're somebody trying to confess, I really, they absolutely do not know what you're talking about. And most of them have never read that. Most of them have never read.
I know this solid Presbyterian who's been Presbyterian for 30 years. And he is whenever I sit down to study or read my Bible, I have my commentary right beside it. And I do not sit down and read my Bible without a commentary. Why can't you read the Bible without a commentary?
Which one do you?
Well, that's the question. How do you know which one to use?
Oh, he needs one. He gets to the one, and he doesn't agree with one.
You'll go to the next one.
Besides,
And it's like, well,
So basically what I just told you is the doctrine is terrible.
yeah. And whenever pressed on it, that's right.
True.
Because he's not Presbyterian, and this is the way that you have to have somebody else interpret the Bible for you. Because we can't we're not capable of doing it. Which is the, and he didn't even know
Back to the other mediators.
He didn't even know what the term neo-Calvinist. I've never even heard of neo-Calvinist.
Well, because they call themselves.
Right?
And I don't know if it's this way. You live here in Ohio, okay? And we live in the suburbs of Atlanta. Every old Baptist church, I say every, probably 80% of them is church. And I'm talking about brick and mortar with the people in the whole nine yards. Baptist, Methodist, whatever they are. If they've been around for a while, they have the old architecture. They've gone and taken the island sign, the monument sign up front. And if they haven't already done it permanently, they've hung a temporary vinyl banner over it with a new, kind of a crooked cross that kind of looked like a hand sketch. And the, the name of it is like in this modern, you know what I'm talking about, like a new, is that going on? I mean, it's got like the blue and the green color scheme to make it look more corporate. More, little younger, like the 20.
Yeah, it's very corporate, very hip, very, very, very contemporary looking, I guess.
Contemporary. They kind of get rid of the old stones.
Anything that reeks of like tradition and old school, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And your official.
Did you get Collins?
Where did Paul disappear to? Because he's got to set us. We got to get going here in 10 minutes.
Honey.
He said we're on.
I got over here. You know what time I got over here? It was still dark outside. And he was supposed to have gotten here at 7.
I was helping him get stuff. I got up at 7. He was still cluttering around the house and stuff together, and I. Sorry.
He claims there's no such thing. And the boys and I, we look at each other. I'm trying to get it to go. It's like,
Well, you guys called me and you didn't want to.
yeah, it feels like you. There's no way to go crazy. But when he does get focused on something,
Laser beam.
I'm gonna use an expression like that. Tell them how you are. And he says, I have to wait. Or, you know what, like that. And bless his heart, he knows that I leave at 7 in the morning and don't get home at 7. So, bless his heart, he is wonderful. He's there that when you have a house full of people, you can police, make sure everybody picks up everything, so they what's right, so but so he's just a good God. But I told him, and he complains that I started at the front of our house, and also laying stuff down. And so I get to the kitchen first.
I know this is going.
Watch, and then I get to the kitchen, my foot. So then before I leave in the morning, he passed me down, he said, first, I'll eat, we watch, and then I'll look, and I go, phone, where's my phone? Where's my phone? Then we have to go look and see where I lay down. Because I'll start at front, and I'm thinking dinner, and so, you know, for everything, in its place, and that's very good. I go, I'll put it in the place, and I go, I have lots of places. I don't remember which place it was that I put it. He tried to help me get organized. And but
Or else you'll be like,
We go to his mom's every day. So I say, and I don't like, if I want to, you know, because I know she'll have to always do it. I'll say, "Hey, we need 30 minutes, 50, no, we didn't. Give me one more minute. Give me one more minute. I've got to use something else. Yeah, I'll say, okay, I've got everything in the car. I'll sit out there. This is control. So, I need to go to bed. Yes, stay to bed. How long? Because they can get in the car and set. And I would say, we'll keep doing that. 35. He said, we're in. Do all this stuff. What do you want? Yeah, I got my good stuff. I got my good shots. I do. I'm reading. That was the honeymoon, okay? And from April, and there was there it is. It's there, and there he is.
Well, I think he's like a lot of keeping information, John. And
He has to say, and he does connect to a lot of people. I'm just doing that many. He does, and he does feel important. Especially sometimes he'll get on there and it'll be going back and forth, arguments too, and he's on his blog.
I've seen those comments. I've gotten to the point now where I can see this is going to be a while, so I'm not going to catch it right now. Otherwise, I'll be here for the next 2 hours getting caught up.
And then it's Facebook, then he gets on Facebook.
and then Twitter, and then, yeah.
Then, on Facebook, it's like, well, I'm just checking on the kids. And I go, that looks like Danny. Danny's not one of our kids. I go, well, what are they doing? I don't know what they're always doing.
Where did he go?
He went home. It's hot in here. How do we?
Oh, here's the thermostat right here.
You got it now. Or
Take it on.
74, where are we at here?
You might have to put it on hold.
No, more.
70, delete 70.
72 is going to get chilly.
Yeah, you look at chili at 72. Yeah. Because it's programmed, so we temporarily overridden it until the next rubber. So hopefully it comes on here.
I think I'm gonna move us up without Deborah's permission and hope she doesn't get mad
Well,
at me.
now, for my.
I was going to call you guys back row Baptists.
Yeah, chosen.
Yeah.
Do you have the theme song? Is that what you're going to do?
Which one of you guys is talking about a choice? And if Rush has some lyrics in one of their songs. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Which is pretty philosophical for a rock band.
Yeah, Rush got that from that new brand.
Yeah. I moved this up.
We've
come up in the
He's
world.
got my, he made a copy of a CD for me and that I'm gonna need for my second talk. So I don't need this up here yet.
Okay.
You can move them. I just dropped a piece of liquor one here.
I want to get to look at them.
Oh, actually, I do it too.
Okay. Oh, I was looking at that. No, only one thing working. I don't know if I don't want to work. So, only one thing, just one. Oh, what about this one, John, this is John Dewey? This kind of, oh, man. This was really good. It went through, like, philosophical thought through, like, law, Edwards. That's later. Yeah, Becky, and so, do you remember much later? Yeah, that's the problem. Are you done some quotes. I'm here to talk about self-determination. And how none is really Edwards there on these. It seems that Edwards was the hard as a younger. Here you go. He realized it doesn't mean good. He used law. He was a little richer than what we're used to. That changed him a little. He kind of used this framework for his own ideas. Everybody finds that the and he was such a brilliant man. That's all I can do. He's go on and on. He's always
Back in there.
Yeah. That one, I was he just, it was
Susan, you have slides for your stuff? You do not?
But he has a cute side to him, but I want to bring.
He has a what side?
Cute, as a young teenager.
Oh, yeah, innocent.
Naive,
Yeah.
but he accepted. When he got to having his own church there, and wrote events on the side, he couldn't understand why the young people, they would have this difference in the Lord. And then, you know,
Hey, buddy boy.
everybody copied his name for him.
Everybody should sing the same thing.